And good afternoon, folks. Welcome to What Are the Odds with Barnes and Baris. I am one half of the show, Rich Baris, the People's Pundit. Robert will join us shortly. So, casually on Sunday, 60 Minutes does a segment on UFOs, which we polled, you remember, about a month ago. And I was just tweeting about a little bit ago. So before Robert gets on, I'll talk about Ohio and Cheney being tossed out. We put out some voter analysis, the locals community. I hope you guys like that. We're going to be doing a lot more like that in the future, especially with the cool new tools that we got. You see some of those graphics? They were pretty neat. But in any event, we polled that, something we've polled a few times over the years. And the highlights are 18% of voters told us they personally witnessed a UFO. Now, naval aviators that they had on, are credible witnesses. These are guys who are in the skies all the time. They know what does and does not move certain ways. So I think it's kind of big that 60 Minutes just did a report on it. And I also think that others who are pointing out that report was more hard news than anything political we've seen in a while is also a credible criticism of 60 Minutes. But in any event, 18% of voters told us that they personally witnessed a UFO. That is up 6 points from April of 2018, about 3 years ago, when we asked the question. It was 12%. Another 20%, or about 2 in 10 for both, said that they know somebody who sincerely believes that they witnessed a UFO. Probably most important, rounding up here, 39% believe that at least some sightings can be attributed to legitimate visitations to the planet Earth from an extraterrestrial life form. That compares to about 32%, a little under 32%, who say that it is not, that it is natural phenomena or human activity. That is the first time ever that we saw that question shift more towards, even though there's still a huge amount of undecideds, that shift more people telling us that they believe that at least some of these sightings are legitimate visitations from extraterrestrial life forms from another world. All right. So look, we're ahead of the curve again here. I know it's like people looked at me crazy. I got a whole bunch of emails. What the hell are you doing polling this stuff? Look, Gallup polls similar questions and has for years. I think it's an important issue when you have some of the developments that we are having. I mean, these aren't crazy people who are coming out of there like, I don't want to stereotype anybody. But these aren't crazy people who are like pointing up at the skies after a 12-pack going, I think I see some lights. That's not what's going on here. So I think it's pretty interesting. And then also, look, some people will not be willing to tell you what they really think. If you ask them a question like we asked, do you think the government knows more about the UFO phenomena than it is letting on? And over 60% tell you yes. And the disparity is a few points away from people who say they believe extraterrestrial life exists elsewhere in the universe, which was about 6 in 10 anyway, 58 plus, 59 actually rounded up. Then that can show a little bit of I don't know if I want to call it a social desirability bias, but it is a little bit of a hesitancy to tell us whether or not they think that that's, alien life or something. All right. Look, I got a photo I want to show you. I'll show it again when Robert joins us, but this is Ohio. Okay, the other day we got for the peoplespundit.locals.com community, peoplespundit.locals.com community, we were asked a question about Virginia. So we ran the voter file analysis in Virginia, which, given the Republicans got their nominee now, right? And if it's a very bad year for Democrats, is it possible that Republicans could take the governorship in Virginia? All right, it was about 11 years ago when Republican Bob McDonnell romped a Democratic governor, a Democratic candidate for governor, in a bad year for Democrats, even though Virginia was clearly moving to the left. Now, demographically, Virginia has changed a lot in 11 years, so it will be much harder. But it's worth noting that a little bit before the election, or early 2020, we took Virginia off the map. We ran the voter analysis, it was D+4. But all of those independents tend to vote with Democrats more often than not in that state. So in the end, we were looking at it and we basically said it's not in play. It would have to be a complete wipeout. It's not in play. But then we ran it again to answer a question somebody had just asked last week about Virginia with the governor's race coming up after the GOP nominated their candidate. We ran it again, and it's D+1. Why does that surprise me? We just had an election. All of these data attributes come flooding into the voter file. The machine learning model takes all of these data attributes, at least 400 on each record in most cases, and decides whether or not we can infer this person is a Republican, infer it's a Democrat, infer it's an independent. It's extremely accurate. We're using FEC records for donations. We're using subscriptions to different, different magazines, whatever it may be. What do you look at tells you a lot about, or what you read tells me a lot about who you are and who you may vote for. It's scary, but that's the age we live in. And after Joe Biden supposedly carried the state of Virginia, or officially carried the state of Virginia by 10 points, you would not expect Virginia to go in the other direction. You would expect it to go to like D+8, D+7, D+6. That's what I was thinking was going to pop up, but it didn't. It was D+1. And if you're on our locals community, you got to read that. You saw all about it. Look, and then we have this thing with Liz Cheney going on. And Adam Kinzinger being the knight in shining armor, the knight in shining warmonger, coming to defend the distressed maiden Liz Cheney from the big bad Trumplicans who want to toss her out of the party, and the cowards who won't defend her like Kevin McCarthy. Look, I'll tell you right now, on Saturday, Liz Cheney survived an initial call. If it was not a voice vote, or either on the record or a voice vote where we know who voted how, I'll tell you right now, Liz Cheney would have survived. That is the state of the GOP. So don't think because Liz Cheney got ousted and replaced with Elise Stefanik that the Republican Party is somehow, listening to their base off the cuff. They're not. They'll do whatever they possibly can to survive this. Kevin McCarthy feels the speaker's gavel in his grasp. He will offer up whoever he has to offer up to get to this midterm, because he has long wanted to be Speaker of the House. For those who don't remember, Paul Ryan became the Speaker because he was the compromise candidate. That was Kevin McCarthy's turn, or at least he believed it was. But he didn't have the votes. It was going to get messy. So Paul Ryan had to step forward so he could unite the David Jolly wing of the party with others, even some in the Liberty Caucus. Kevin McCarthy was not going to get all of those wings of the party to come together. All right, so Virginia's Virginia. That's one thing. And the Liz Cheneys of the world would say, well, we could, look how bad we did in a state like Virginia, Virginia because of Donald Trump. In a post-Trump era, maybe we can do better with Virginia. I ask you now, which is smarter? Which is smarter? Erasing the gains you made in other states in a Hail Mary to try to take back Virginia in the short term, which would probably take time. It probably could win a gubernatorial election in a good Republican wave year. No doubt. I have no doubt. I see a built-in 8-point advantage. A wave can eat 8 points, no problem. Honestly, it can. Especially in a governor's race. Tip O'Neill was right about governor's races. All politics really are local. But look at Ohio. Let's take a look at Ohio. This is a state that for decades was decided on a tiny margin. Either way, no Republican could win the White House without it. Barack Obama won it about around 4 points in 2008. Barely held on to it in 2012, a little under 2.5 points, roughly, right? And then Donald Trump comes in, wins it by 9 points, 8 points, 9 points, both times. This is what Ohio now looks like. When I put this up, focused on the northeastern part of the state. You have Trumbull County over there. Off to the west, you have Woods and others. These are areas that Republicans like Mitt Romney would have no chance of carrying. This was Barack Obama territory. Now you're going to see Franklin County square in the middle of the state. That is how Democrats have been able to keep some margins. Used to be those suburbs out in Franklin County, those exurbs and suburbs, that was Bush country. But Bush only won the state by 2 points. That's it. That is all. So you tell me which one is worth it. This is Ohio. As it stands now, dark red is known Republican. We are certain that is a Republican vote. Light red is an inferred Republican. Look, we're not certain, but we are very confident. Those are Republicans. Dark blue, obviously, known Democrats. We know they're a Democratic vote. Light blue is also, an inferred Democrat. We're not 100% sure, but we are very, very confident when we infer. Franklin is in the middle of the state. Look at Franklin County. Republicans can get crushed in Ohio among independents and still win the state. And honestly, pretty comfortably. 5 points, even if they were to get crushed. This is now an R plus 10 state. Republicans start off with a base that is around 42% of the vote in the Buckeye state. Full stop. 42%. Democrats represent about 32%. That is what they can count on in the Buckeye. They have to win the rest of that 26%. They have to win the lion's share to get to 50 plus 1. Or they need mass Republican defections. Or they need some of those light red voters who now came to the Republican Party because Donald Trump used to vote Democrat in the past. Look at the southeastern part of the state. See how it butts up against Appalachia. That second to, what's this, like the fourth pie up in the southeast corner. That county was Barack Obama's county twice. Now look at it. That region is why we underestimated Donald Trump in 2016 so badly in this state. We didn't make the same mistake this time. We knew this was going to be a Trump plus 10, nearly 10 state. We listened to these people this time. Like, unlike last time where we didn't take them for granted. I just did not believe that many Democrats were going to now consider themselves Republicans, or at least for the time being. At least for Donald Trump, they were going to. While you're looking at this, because what this graph says to you, it should jump right out at you, not competitive. This is not a competitive state anymore under the current status quo. Unless Republicans insist on following Adam Kinzinger and Liz Cheney off the freaking cliff. If you want to know how they can squander all of these gains, it's to follow warmongers who don't talk about any of the issues that matter to Americans at all and are spending all of their time obsessed with Donald Trump, and when they're not talking about that, they're talking about issues nobody cares about, like war and how much more money can we spend on defense when 10 million people are out of work, when unemployment is rising even though job openings are at a record high, when labor force participation is well below the critical 63% threshold and is not likely to get above there anytime soon. When stagnant wages they have already become stagnant. They're growing, but their growth rate has stopped. It's stunted. Those wage gains we saw last month were completely erased by inflation. Actually, inflation rose slightly more, about 1/10 of a percentage point, than we saw average hourly earnings. None of these issues that these people talk about matter to the voters in the Buckeye State. And if you think Republicans can't squander this by making a foolish mistakes, because you really got to be an idiot and blow this, then you're kidding yourself. And that's why it's big news what's going on with Liz Cheney. It's not the end all be all, but it is big news. Again, this is a state that Republicans needed to win still to get to the White House. But it was before the era of Donald Trump. They had to draw an inside straight. Or what's the top? It's like a royal straight flush. So the saying doesn't even do it justice. They needed to win every single battleground state and take the Buckeye State when it would, swing two points or a little bit more in any direction at any given election. Now, that state was not competitive. And it never was, by the way. Despite all the polls from Quinnipiac, despite all of the polls from the New York Times, Siena College with Nate, despite all of the polls from Fox News, the Biden +5 or 3 or whatever it was when we had our Trump +8, it was never a competitive state. The only way that you can erase gains like this is to go back to being the party of Mitt Romney. Because all the way from the southeast, all the way up the eastern region of this state, you will wipe those gains away. You put I don't even know what the word is, technocrat or plutocrat, whichever one's really better for Mitt Romney. You put somebody like that as the face of the party again, and you will lose support from the southeastern county to the northeastern county, all the way up to Trumbull. And that will be a wrap. Because that is how Republicans are offsetting those margins in Cincinnati. Cuyahoga County, you can see it, obviously. The big spike, the big old spike you see there up in the north. It's just not enough for Democrats now. That is their one and only dominant region in the state now. And it's just simply not enough. Especially with Republicans dealing such a blow to what used to be the working class. Robert and I, you hear us talk about it all the time. The ancestral Democrat in this country, the Midwest ancestral Democrat. Donald Trump pushed this coalition shift has matured in this state. I don't know if it's going to keep going. Could it? Yeah, probably. Looking at the voter file, I see voters that basically are missing. Republicans could go out and locate more people in the areas of the country where they do well. There are more people out there to grab. And it's absolutely possible. Let me just peek on Robert here and says what's going on. He's probably waiting in the queue. Let me resend it to him. Give me 1 second, folks. Let me give him another. I may have killed it at the time. He's over there waiting in his queue here. But I want to bring him on because I want him to see this. And again, 8 points can be obliterated if you go back to being the party of Mitt Romney. The traditional Republican country club sweater vest. That doesn't work in that area of the country. It simply doesn't. That's how Barack Obama wins it twice. That's how George Bush barely wins it. Barely. And George Bush probably would have done better in this state. In all honesty, George W. Bush probably would have done better in the Buckeye State if it wasn't for the Iraq War in 2004. He probably would have. Kerry campaign did a good job getting their vote out in Cuyahoga County. But Bush probably would have done a little bit better in and around Franklin if it wasn't for that. He had the national security bombs, but he would have had them anyway. He could have kept them anyway without the war in Iraq. Counterinsurgency would have kept those women on board. All right. Let me see what's going on here with good old Robert here. It says it's waiting for him. Let me see if he's using the new link. Trying to bring him on board here, man. I don't want to miss this. And the same story is, by the way, in Iowa. If you're on the locals thing, you're going to see this soon. Iowa's next. You'll see it in Wisconsin, in certain areas of Wisconsin, which turned out to be way closer than we were even slightly off in Wisconsin. We underestimated Donald Trump in Wisconsin. And doing this voter analysis, it's obvious why we did. These are people that are difficult to reach. They're scarcely populated all over. Wisconsin is more rural than the other Midwest states that they get lumped in with. There are parts of it that just are. There are parts of it that are look more like Iowa, really. There he is. There he is. Yeah, man. So I, totally my fault while I bring in Robert here. Totally my fault because, oh, hell, I mean, I don't really know. I guess I had to do something a little bit different here. But give me a second, folks. Let me bring in Robert here. All right, there he is. My man, Robert, can you hear me? Yeah, can you guys hear him? Go ahead, Robert. Let me see if I can hear you, buddy. All right, go ahead. What did you get a chance to take a look at that image that was up? Yeah, I don't hear him either. You got your thing muted? You got your thing muted, Robert? He may have his thing muted. Yeah, I think it's on your end, buddy. I killed the monitor, so I don't hear it on mine, but... Give me a second. Send me a chat with it. Let me know what's going on when you get back on. I clicked myself for a second there. I knocked myself off there for a second. You can hear me though, right? All right, let's try this again. You can, he can. All right, so go ahead. Let me see if why is his source not there? I'm just not even seeing your audio source, buddy. It's like not picking it up. You just mute it? Yeah, it's picking up mine, but I don't see yours. It's almost like there's mics not in there or something. Let me see though. And you don't hear it at all? Yeah, he doesn't hear it. Try to say something else, buddy. Try to say something else. Oh, I don't hear him. Give me 1 second here. Let me see if I can. I just heard something. I heard something, whatever you tried to do. Yeah, it sounds like he's like on and off. It's like distortion, buddy. I don't know. I hear it, but it's like a distortion. I don't know, bud. I don't know. Hang tight. Let's see if we can try to figure it out in a second. There you are. I heard you. There you go. Now I hear you.
Okay.
Yeah, you're live now, buddy. Now you're live. I don't know what that was, but we got you now. Did you get it? Did you get a chance?
It's not picking up this. It's only picking up the computer.
Oh, all right, all right. Did you get a chance? Did you see the Who cares? Roll with it. Did you see the image for Ohio? Did you see this?
Yes, I did.
Look at this, Robert. Now that look, you and I have been around for a while. This is extraordinary. This is not 2012 anymore. This isn't even 2018 anymore. This is an incredible shift that occurred in 2 years. We started to see Ohio go, pretty much to the right over the last couple of years, but the voter file before the election was R8. It's now over R10. So it's 42 Republican, 32 Democrat. And it's accurate. It was accurate before. It's accurate now. I mean, what do you make of this?
I think that the realignment is still taking place. So I think there is a meaningful realignment in the context of Trump, and that realignment will stay in force as long as the Republican Party doesn't abandon Trumpism. So and I think it's also as much a reaction to Democratic agendas, talking points. And I think we saw that in the UK elections as well. Even though they were local elections, what we're seeing is that sort of the theory of the Labour Party in the UK was that a neoliberal face of the party, a milquetoast Biden-like face of the Labour Party, would have a comparable outcome as what happened in the States in 2020. And instead, what happened was they got decimated far worse than they ever did in local elections under Corbyn. And so I think what that generally reflects is that, and generally there is correlationship between the UK political trends and the US political trends. This goes back, 1940s, Churchill's thrown out in order to restore the economy in the same way Truman wins, and surprisingly in 1948. Then Churchill comes back in the 50s for more normalcy, just as Eisenhower did. Then you had sort of the split in the 60s in UK like you did in the States. Margaret Thatcher previewed the foreshadowed Ronald Reagan. John Major foreshadowed or followed Poppy Bush. Tony Major corresponded to Bill Clinton. And the collapse of the Labour Party in 2010 foreshadowed the Republican rise in the House and the Senate. And Brexit foreshadowed Trump. And so I think that the fact that Labour did so poorly, it's just local elections, but generally is significant trend-wise, shows that the same group, working class voters, are not listening to the liberal, neoliberal, left Labour Democratic message. And that means that more than ever, they need to reproduce the unusual aspects of 2020. And so far, they haven't been able to do that. Just a complete disaster in the suburban seat in Texas that was supposed to be up for grabs. They're not even in the runoff. And I think we'll see more trends like that in subsequent elections. I think now Virginia governor's race, as you note, has a lot of idiosyncratic potential factors. So, how much that doesn't always predict things, though generally speaking, the Virginia governor's race tends to be opposite the party in presidential power. But so I think it'll be more competitive. And as you note, Virginia's underlying dynamics haven't been trending as Democratic as expected or anticipated. But I think as long as Ohio is like the Midlands of England, it's rejecting the Democratic.
It really is. Yep.
It's not yet quite accepting the Republican message. That's why whoever the Republican standard bearer is matters. But as you know, when you come in with a base advantage of about 10 points, you just need to win a third of the up for grabs vote, you win the election. So I think that as long as they should have rejected Liz Cheney all the way back at the beginning. It was a mistake not to reject her then. Kevin McCarthy got burned by it. She continued to be disruptive within the party leadership, continued to wait. And this was because the goal and objective was for the post-election January 6th, culminating in January 6th, was the Republican Party plan to purge Trumpism of the party. And it didn't work. Partially, January 6th didn't translate the way they thought it would. But part of it, their efforts to ignore Trump, mostly in the Georgia runoffs, backfired. And then most importantly, that the Republican Party is now just a Trumpian party. And they underestimated that. And so that's why McConnell, by the time of the impeachment vote, they really knew they had lost the attempt to purge Trump of the party. And this was attempt number 20, really. There were, however many in 2015 and then 2016. and then, quietly backing aspects of the Ukrainian impeachment in 2018 and 2019. And they were really behind this. They really thought the world would come to its senses and Americans would be like, man, we can't be anywhere near this crazy Trump guy. Look what he did. He did the worst thing since 9/11 with January 6th. And we apologize and we come back in sackcloth and shame and beg for forgiveness from the cathedral. And instead, people were yelling at him and screaming at him for not being more pro-Trump and for covering up questions about the election. And that's where they're like, well, hold on a second. And I think one thing that's probably not been publicized is my guess is their second quarter fundraising has been very poor.
Yeah.
I guess that their first quarter fundraising was probably great because they were lying about raising funds for the election.
That's right.
Contest. But my guess is the April and May fundraising, and probably it was started in March. It just probably wasn't showing up yet in the official reports because they could disguise what took place in March by emphasizing what happened in January. For McCarthy to flip, I mean, what people don't know is the real reasons why people are put in leadership positions has nothing to do with policy and everything to do with money. It's who can raise money from whom. And that's
damn right.
McCarthy left Liz Cheney in. He believed that Cheney could raise money from the traditional Paul Ryan, Papa Cheney, corporate military defense contractor world. The reality was, she was never proven to be that good at that. And that's where a lot of people had questions from the get-go as to how useful she really was in that context. But I think that she was proving to be counterproductive. The other factor of the Liz Cheney removal reflects is that the popular base of the party, from terms of a donor perspective, increasingly matters more than corporate America and K Street. And this is also probably a mistake of corporate America by joining the woke revolution and opposing the Georgia bill and promising not to fund Republicans. They probably put the final nail in Liz Cheney's coffin because that was the only place Liz Cheney was going to be able to fundraise from. And so without the ability to raise money while continuing to be publicly antagonistic and undermining the grassroots donor base, there was no choice but to dump her, and how unceremoniously she was dumped is a sign of a real turning of the tide, of which the Ohio demographics and partisan trends are reflective and representative. Similarly, just the fact that J.D. Vance is running on a populist ticket, if he runs, is also indicative of that, symbolic of that transition and transformation of the party. And it's a great credit to Trump. Like, whatever people think of Stefanik, that's really it. This was a Trump issue, not a policy issue.
Right.
And people follow me on Twitter, so I'm not.
She was good on impeachment, Robert. End of story. And for him,
much better than Cheney. What it reflects is that Trump and the association with Trump is what was hurting him fundraising wise. And but what it really shows is great credit to Trump. Trump has managed to now kill off 3 of the most horrific political families in the last 40 years. He killed off the Bushes, then he killed off the Clintons, and now he's killed off the Cheneys, which is something worth celebration.
It's a whole new level, though, politics is always, there's double standards, there's hypocrisy, but it's a whole other level to watch the left under Donald Trump, right? George W. Bush, they wanted him tried at The Hague for war crimes. Now he is the moral authority that the Republican Party should listen to. It's incredible. Robert Mueller was this single biggest threat to the Fourth Amendment post 9/11, and then it was #Mueller time every day, right? And now it's Liz Cheney. I mean, Mitt Romney was a gay basher. He beat up gay kids and cut their hair. I mean, it's just incredible how there's hypocrisy, man, and then there's something else. Because this is a woman who is from a family, this, and Trump's statement was hilarious because it was true. Your family is part of the family dynasty who single-handedly bled our country of wealth and resources. You started the dumbest war in the history of the country, and you almost drove us into the ground. I would argue we haven't even recovered from that yet. I mean, we're just significantly weaker ever since the Great Recession, And ever since the wars in in Iraq, we are international power is in relative terms, and relatively speaking, we are much weaker compared to China, compared to others than we have been in the past. Russia is a waning power, but even at this point, with them, their latent power is more impressive than ours is. They're stronger. Their society is strong. Their culture is more stoic, and I think could take a brutal period better than ours can. We're not exactly in the greatest generation anymore, Robert. You know what I mean? Like I don't really think we could tolerate something like. I hope I'm wrong, and I'm not meaning to down talk the country or anything. I'm just saying there doesn't seem to be that kind of barbaric, rugged individualism that made American latent power so scary to everybody, right? You could turn pre-World War I to World War I is a perfect example. You could turn this, sleeping giant became known in World War II, but even before that, barely a standing army, right? And then we just mobilized this force, and the Germans said we came over there, we fought like devils, these were people who, we're rugged individualists, and then got put into a military setting and romped it when Europe couldn't. So I don't see that same culture anymore. And I know the Chinese still value strength in their society. The Russians still value strength in their society. Even the Japanese still value strength in their society. And they don't even have a damn army. They're relying on us. And I just don't see it anymore. I just don't see it. And Trump, in that statement, that's what they hated most about it. Oh, and by the way, I look forward to seeing you on MSNBC or CNN where you'll get your contributorship. It's all so true. He doesn't put it very pretty, but it's all very true. This is a back to the charade, right? A warmonger and her family, her warmongering family, we're all supposed to feel bad for them. And by the way, she'll be just fine. She'll get a nice little job on CNN to trash the Trumplican wing of the party. You don't have to be a math guy, Robert, to see it in the map. They're nothing. They are nothing. Their little 100 signatures, their cute little 100 signatures, that's adorable. You couldn't win Trumbull County without them, so that's all that should matter at the end of the day. Woods, you kidding? Mitt Romney got crushed in these parts of the Midwest, and there's no path to victory without them, period. I just don't understand where these people think all these votes are coming from. They just must not care. What do you think? Yeah, you really think Adam Kinzinger's this dumb?
I think Liz Cheney just made a calculated error. And it reflected what they all thought. They all thought Trump was an anomaly, that he snuck in. And it was clear when I was down after the election in November in Georgia that they really thought Trump was the reason why they didn't win more House seats. Senate seats. They thought that the problem was Trump. And so they thought the way they could fix that problem was by removing Trump and put things in motion to do so. They wanted to purge Trump of the party and purge the party of Trump. And they just misread the party. They did not understand that Trump really walked into a populist vacuum that he took over. But Trump wasn't the reason for Trumpism.
That's exactly
Trump
right.
Was Trump's creation in response to audience demand. The man's always been a marketer. He's not always been a populist. He's always been a marketer. Populism is what the Republican Party wanted. And they now, I think, mostly come to terms with that. But Cheney was the last one to be a holdout. Cheney really thought, no, resisting Trump would make her pop. Remember, this goes all the way back to the convention in 2016, where all the people around Ted Cruz, and I was arguing with some of them because some of them were friends of mine, were arguing that Cruz should give this speech at the convention where he refuses to endorse Trump. And I said, no, he should do what Reagan, even if you dislike Trump, he should do what Reagan did for Ford in 1976. And I was like, then Cruz could become a hero and pick up the mantle of Trumpism. And I said, if he doesn't, he will forever torch his future. And there'll be limits to, he will never be fully embraced or accepted within the Trump part of the party ever because of it. And they did it. And they were all excited because of who was cheering for them. It was all the people on the left. I was like, that you should be upset that that's who's cheering for you. I was like, that's a massive mistake. Now, Cruz recognized his mistake by October. That's why he was begging on his knees to make phone calls for Trump. He was like Romney. He was begging on his knees. like 2012. And so, but Cheney, that group of people is totally disconnected from the base. They did not. They still don't understand that Bush-style republicanism died. It really died twice. It kind of died in 1992. They just didn't appreciate it. They were able to get back in because of dissatisfaction with Clinton-Gorism. But there was, and then 9/11 gave them a temporary fig leaf. And when that fig leaf was gone, their credibility was gone, but it was definitely dead by 2006. And they don't understand that. They don't accept that. And they don't think that was the case. They think it was an anomaly that Romney lost in 2012.
Yeah, they do.
So their whole view was, if we could just get rid of Trump. And I think Liz Cheney really thought a bunch of people would popularly rally to her cause, and she would get to retake over the party in the name of anti-Trumpism and of purging Trump. And she didn't understand there's no popular support for this. Not just in Wyoming, there just isn't anywhere. And she's just the latest person to realize that it's a major mistake, that they're just wrong about where the country is, about where not only the party is, but where the country, they just don't understand. And I think she wouldn't have done what she did if she thought that her position was as unpopular as it is. She's someone else that's shocked. And you see the media shocked. Like, oh my God, they're removing how can they be doing this? Republican Party still likes Trump. Don't they know January 6th was 9/11 part 2? They don't understand. And so their disconnection to the public that continues to haunt them and allows them to make easy mistakes that allows Trump to profit from it. But it's good for Trumpism and populism in the party that Liz Cheney has nowhere near a position within it.
And that's why you see them grasping at things, anything they really can, And I'm not picking on Byron York. I was railing against him on the other show last week. But I'm not picking on him, but it's a perfect example. The NBC poll, it is insinuating that the party's ready to move on from Trump or something like that. That's ridiculous. I mean, there's polls and then there's results, guys. And then these models are accurate. They are basing off of voter behavior, what we know about different people. Wisconsin, by the way, I was wrong in Wisconsin. That electorate was not that Democratic, which makes me really, really, really scratch my head over Wisconsin, because you said this a number of times before the election, and it's worth pointing out. A lot of Wisconsin, the state overall doesn't look like Pennsylvania and Michigan, largely because of geography, area type. It is not as urban and not even as suburban as the rest of those Midwestern states. It looks more like Iowa, and when we run it through the voter file, Robert, it's like R5 now. And that's a little bit more Republican than it was in November. In the end, I just don't, I'll be honest, I don't know, we had a little bit Biden lead, but I released that with a caveat and said if this electorate is more Republican than this is modeled, Trump's going to win it. He's going to win it. And, I mean, that was up against what? The ABC Langer research, Biden plus 17, the New York Times, Biden plus 11, right? And all these other crazy. They're just not reaching these people, because when you look at them geographically where they are, these are people, if you know anything about this this area of the country, they're at a point now where they don't want to talk to anybody. They're done. They're going to vote how they're going to vote. They're not going to talk to you. They're not going to tell you about it. It's very, very difficult. And I just don't think pollsters, even now, are going to be willing to do what is necessary to reach them, right? Because it's a numbers game. They're not going to participate like the other groups are. So you have to oversample them and oversample them and oversample them and oversample them, because when we do reach those areas, it skews too liberal. You damn sure know it's not going to vote like that. That is why the polls were coming back in rural America, for instance, 55-45, because they're just more likely. Your example, the librarian in Greene County is just much more likely to speak to you than the welder is, or whatever it may be. So, this is not going to get any better anytime soon with these numbers, I'm telling you. I know we don't have a whole, oh, go ahead.
I was saying, I know Trump put out a release about it. I forget which one. Maybe it was Wall Street Journal. Maybe it was New York Times. Someone put out that, of course, this was the biggest polling error by more pollsters than any election in history. So because we had so many more pollsters involved in such broader range and such closer timeframes to the election, that this will go down as the 2020 is the greatest polling error in history.
Well worse than 2016. 2016 was not remotely this bad. Some nationals were really bad. The AP was really bad nationally. You know, a lot of others were really bad. But nationally, as an average, it wasn't horrible. States were off because, you know, I had to take a crack at Tom the other day because he tweets, you know, about journalistic errors. And he said, true errors are random. And I had to quote tweet him and say, yeah, Tom, just like polling errors and election forecast errors, they should be random too. We had Biden. We overestimated Biden a little bit too much in Minnesota. We overestimated Trump a little bit too much in Arizona, for instance, right? It goes both ways. We underestimated Trump by about a half a point in Florida, but rounding up, it was Trump +3, so I'll take it, right? But, you know, these go in both directions. There is no legitimate reason for a pollster, one or all, to have all of the errors in one direction. It's just not, I don't even know how that's possible. I've been doing this for years. That has never happened to me. Never have I, you know, widely overestimated one party and, you know, and not the other. And people just don't seem to understand when we're looking back at these polls. Even if I'm wrong, which I don't think I was, by the way, I'll take it to my grave. A Trump +1 in Pennsylvania is still more accurate than a Biden +6 or more. Doesn't anybody understand that statistically? I'm doing a bad job of explaining my job, Robert, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I mean, no question. The media polls were badly wrong. That they were the worst that they had made mistakes ever. You know, your polling was the closest again. But they're not likely to come to terms with or accept what they did. But, you know, I think in that same sort of capacity, where people have been asking about what should have been done in the Chauvin trial or other trials. Mm-hmm. And as a general matter, there are ways to poll. What they should have done is poll Minneapolis, Hennepin County, and then poll the rest of the state, or poll, but maybe by media market in other parts of the state, but at least create meaningful data to know whether there is more bias in Hennepin County on the George Floyd murder case than there is in other parts of the state, so that the judge has empirical information to make his determination. The other is to do really good jury polling before a case. And that you have to be careful, because if you do selective focus groups or selective mock jurors, you get odd results. You get results that are all over the place.
Yeah, you could Frank Luntz it real easy.
Correct. And if you know what you're doing, then you're in a much more informed position to make good judgment. You also know who is a problem versus who isn't, in terms of attitudinally or demographically, ideally both, based on the likely narratives to develop at trial. And that's when you'll know if a young African-American man that lives in Minneapolis that identifies with the Democratic Party, there's almost no chance he's going to be sympathetic to your case, even when he says all the right things on the stand. No,
can he get in any trouble for that? Can Mr. Mitchell, because I'm not a lawyer and I'm getting this question all the time from people, can Mr. Mitchell get in trouble for lying on his questionnaire?
Oh, yes. Now, he has some potential excuses, because they didn't swear an oath at the time of the questionnaire. They were only going to swear an oath when they came in for jury. And the judge had him say, is there anything about that? Now you swear that it's true. And there's questions about, well, maybe it was true at the time, or maybe he thought it was true at the time versus knew it wasn't true later. He can definitely be prosecuted with perjury. They almost never do it, and they really never do it when it favors the prosecution. If it favors the defense, then they'll prosecute a juror.
Right.
Because the prosecution who controls that, whether that juror gets prosecuted or not. So why in the world is he going to prosecute a juror who's on his side, who lied to be on his side? Doesn't happen. There are 3 jurors who lied in the Snipes case, admitted during jury selection they lied during jury selection. It enraged other jurors. They ended up compromising on 3 misdemeanors that 9 of the jurors thought he was completely guilty of. And they complained about it later to the court. That, look, 3 people lied to get on the jury, bragged about lying to get on the jury, and coerced a verdict we didn't believe was actually a true verdict. The judge went out of his way to say, golly gee, we really can't get into that. And he had 100 excuses as to why. So this is the nature. Yes, he can be prosecuted. 0 chance he will be.
Yeah.
Just due to the politics of the situation. But you would know he's lying if you have body language experts there that really know what they're doing, or as important, have done polling prior to trial, so you know who is likely to be lying. You know which attitudes matter. You know which demographics have consequence. You have all the data about them. I increasingly believe that the Chauvin jury people, that they had no jury expert, that they did no polling. I know they did no venue polling because they produced none for the judge. And the judge
they would have showed it to him.
The absence of that polling for refusing to move the venue. So I mean that was, borderline malpractice by the show. And I think Eric Nelson's a great defense lawyer. Most lawyers make the same mistake he made, but increasingly it's borderline malpractice because you're putting people on a jury that you should have known and would have known were bad had you had their whole data file. So, for example, if you had that guy up there, if you had the data file that we utilize, we would know his social media history. We would know his associations. We would know his memberships. We would know his affiliations. We would know his likely partisan party tendencies. Some states have party registration, some don't, but there's lots of ways, as you were pointing out in the voter file, to do meaningful inference to a high degree of success if you know what you're doing. Some voter files are not good, but if you know how to aggregate the data correctly, you can be very good. And if they, my guess is a real meaningful, just a voter file, and I guess, I don't think there's anything limiting. You could probably look him up and see what your data file would show about him. My hunch is your data file would infer a strong Democrat.
Yeah.
And then you know he's lying about some stuff. When he said, I think Floyd Chauvin didn't have any intent. And he was saying magic words to get on the jury. And they were effective, too. They were smart and well thought out. It's very much like the movie. What was the name of it? The great the John Grisham book turned into a Runaway Jury.
Oh, Runaway Jury. Yeah, with Gene Hackman. He did, it was a great book and a good movie. They did it really good justice.
He did the same. It's like he took that book because he knew. I thought he might be one of the defense jurors, lead jurors. That's how good he was at the state.
Yep.
But I didn't have the information. I didn't even know his name. I didn't even see him. So I had no body language to go off of. Didn't know most of his statements. Didn't see his original answers to his questionnaire. So we didn't have access to that the defense did. Clearly, they made a major mistake. So for people out there, they need to start hiring and using intelligently good pollsters and public opinion data to filter out who's a problematic juror, to filter out how weak or strong their defenses may be, and to figure out venue transfers where that can be appropriate. You need data to support that, data to substantiate. We used that in the Snipes case part to get jury selection. And then we knew what we needed to know about people in order to filter it out, and then came up with the questions that would filter it out. And got rid of all but a few. I mean, half the jury pool was originally very bad. We got them all struck right out of the gate.
Oh, where you are? I know that area well. I can't believe you got the jury you got. I mean, it's just...
Well, it's the per capita capital of race hatred events over the prior 10 years.
Yeah.
I mean, they still had a statute to the founder of the Ku Klux Klan, whose name they misspelled, funnily, which I thought was great, because they thought he was named after like he was named after the local Ocala National Forest. Nathan Bedford Forest at school, that one. But they misspelled him at Ocala. And, I was the first one to raise all these issues. And then they tried to hide the statute. They took it from in front of the county and moved it behind the courthouse and tried to pretend it wasn't really there. I found it anyway. So so I mean, there are ways to do that. But as to that subject matter, I think that's important. The other topic I think is good to jump into is the Israeli topic, both for domestic politics and international affairs. And there's really two things people should know about the Israeli conflict in Palestine. Number one, the Palestinian issue has nothing to do with Palestinians in the Arab world. Not really. The Palestinian issue is about Arab nationalism. And Arab nationalism is about being anti-Israel. If you understand that, you can understand the whole history of the Palestinian movement. You can understand why other countries react the way they do, and you can understand why no peace agreement's ever possible. Because they're not in. You understand why the Palestinians, or the leaders of the Arabs in the Palestinian region, rejected a two-state solution in the 1920s, rejected it again in the 1930s, rejected even a one-state solution in 1939, where the
Yes,
Arabs
wasn't good enough.
They still rejected that because they didn't want any Israeli presence and didn't want to be limited to Palestine. They don't believe in Palestine as a place or region because it never has been. There's been the Jewish homeland that goes all the way back, but there's been no country of Palestine. There's been the British mandate of it, the Roman Empire of it, but there's been no Arab Palestine. Doesn't exist. Mythology they built up later. And you understand why they rejected it in the 1940s, not once but twice, why they rejected it again in the 1960s, and why they rejected it again in 2000. Because
leading to a war almost every time.
Palestinian well-being. They're interested in being anti-Israel. To be pro-Arab under Arab nationalism is to be anti-Israel. Indeed, anti-Israel is the major symbolic issue that they're all trying to co-opt. And once you understand that mindset, you understand why Jordan kicked the PLO out. You understand why Lebanon kicked the PLO out. You understand why nobody in the Mideast will accept the PLO. They had to go all the way to Tunisia to have a base of operations. You understand why Nasser, the great pan-Arab nationalist, refused to even talk to them until after the debacle of 1967. You understand why Syria has always been hostile to them. You understand why Iran backs Hezbollah, because, again, they're anti-Israel. They're not really pro-Palestine, but they're anti-Israel. Because to be pro-Arab is to be anti-Israel since the early 1900s, all the way back to 1905, long before the British mandate, long before the Balfour Agreement or anything else, before the UN mandate, you name it. That's part one. Part two is to understand that, particularly amongst the Jewish left, but the left in general, there is no pan-Jewish record. There is a bunch of, on the left, particularly amongst the Jewish left, a deeply anti-Israel sentiment. And this is not understood. This goes back to 1917. The British elite, Lord George and the rest, really believed in the various crazy Jewish conspiracy theories. So they thought because there was a certain number of Jewish people as part of the new Soviet Union, that meant that if they were pro-Zionism, they first thought there was a Jewish conspiracy theory of disproportionate influence in media, finance, and the Communist Party as well. And second, they believed that all of them were for Zionism. So consequently, they thought, hey, if we come out for a Jewish state in the Mideast and pro-Zionist, then the communists will continue the Russian Empire's alignment with us against Germany, Austro-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. They thought the U.S. would have the same reaction. Completely wrong, of course, in both cases, because nobody's more anti-Zionist than parts of the Jewish left, but particularly the communist left in general, Jewish or non-Jewish. And that's why the Russian communist reaction was to say Zionism was a capitalist conspiracy, to be ruthlessly opposed to it, and to leak the secret treaties that Britain and France had done to carve up the Middle East and not give either group anything under their original provisions. So it didn't fully work in that capacity, but in terms of undermining British and French objectives. But what it showed was the left, particularly the Communist Party, has always been anti-Israel all the way through. There was slight sympathy by the Soviet Union right after World War II, solely because the original Israeli settlers were mostly socialists and because many of the Arabs had sided with the Nazis. Indeed, the first big leader of the Palestinian,
that's right,
the Grand Mufti of Palestine, was the Arab leader for the Nazis. He spent almost all of the 40s during World War II in Germany, creating a Muslim SS division and propagandizing against Jews and making sure that the Nazis did not allow Jews to emigrate to Palestine, but instead made sure they got sent to detention camps and to be ultimately killed instead. And if you have any doubts about his intentions, just listen to his broadcast to the Muslim world saying, wherever you find Jews, please kill them. Kill them all. That was the first big leader of the Palestinian Arab movement. And it's an important point to remember. And it's also probably why the Soviet Union was initially not that sympathetic to the Palestinian Arab cause in 1948. And they thought the socialist regimes and tendencies of the young Israeli state may be helpful to them. It was quickly revealed that Israeli socialism had nothing in common with communism, and the historic anti-Zionist, anti-Israel bias of the left, especially the communist left and many of the Jewish left like Finkelstein and Chomsky, became virulently, and Greenwald violently, anti-Israel. And this is what. And once you understand both of those constructs, the historic left hatred of Israel and the Arab obsession with Israel as an expression of Arab nationalism, being anti-Israel, not about being pro-Palestine, a lot of you can explain the past, understand the present, and predict the future a lot better in terms of what's going on in the Mideast. And you can either like or hate Israel, but just a brief little history of Palestine. Israel is the only place that's really had a long-term nation state in the region. And they did for over 1,000 years. Prior to being, the Greeks, the Egyptians came in and beat them. Babylonians came in and dominated. Greeks came in and dominated. Romans came in and dominated. Egyptians came in and dominated. They all, at various times, they're under other authorities. But they, as a continuous state, country, and civilization at some level, is by far the longest lasting in the Levant.
Philistines, the Syrians. Yeah, I mean, it goes on and on.
And not only that, after they get kicked out in the first century, it doesn't become an Arab region. For the next 1,000 years, it's a Christian region. Yeah. It's not an Arab region. It's only when they come back in the 12th century and overthrow them that it becomes a dominant Muslim region. And even then, as the census in the 1840s and 1850s shows, Jerusalem remains majority Jewish. There isn't this special Muslim celebration of Jerusalem like there is Mecca and Medina. It's not even close. The Muslims have never been a majority of Jerusalem since at least the 1800s, maybe never, period. They built the Temple Mount there. That part's right. But it was mostly recognizing Jewish tradition as much as it was. It's not like Muhammad ever visited. So he never did. So Muhammad is Mecca and Medina entirely.
Yeah, it's to recognize the father of it all, Abraham. I mean, that's it. And that spans them all. It's not inherently Muslim.
No. And then so what happens in the mid-1850s, the Palestinians and the anti-Israelis will build this huge fairy tale and fiction and fabrication and mythology. This mythology that the Jews came and invaded our land and displaced all of us and stole our properties and then evicted all of us. Almost all of that is false. There's tiny little kernels of things like that happening, but they are not the bulk of the story. The bulk of the story is you could just read Mark Twain in the 1850s who visited the Palestine region. It's mostly empty because what had happened was the Ottoman Empire, which dominated it for about 400 years, had various conflicts with some Egyptians in the area, with Egypt that ended up impacting the area, other people in the area. There was a peasant revolt in the 1830s. And consequently, they ended up purging the area frequently, expelling people frequently, and destroying the ability of irrigation frequently. And it became a very unarable land and undesirable land. So under Ottoman land titles, the way that tended to work was you had a lot of absentee owners because of the way the tax system worked. So there were a lot of people who didn't declare their ownership. And so basically a lot of people under the Ottoman Empire became absentee owners.
I can't use that strip. I'm not paying for it.
Exactly.
That's it. Yeah.
Jews were a godsend to these absentee owners because they could charge extortionate prices because of hostility to Jews being in the region and get a lot of money. And what happened was Jewish settlers, who almost all settled there, not in the name of Zionism, but escaping oppression in Europe. I mean, just try to figure out how did Ashkenazi Jews go from being millions of people to a few thousand by the 14th century? Because Europe wasn't expelling them frequently when they said they were. Like they said, the Jews went on a migration out of Spain. No, there was mass extermination is what was like place. And it was just covered up in mass. But again, they're experiencing the pogroms of Russia and in the Ukraine region in particular. So they fled to someplace that could be safe. Zionism arose out of oppression of Jews, not out of anything else. And even then, there was, when they first came there, they went to unoccupied land, bought it, paid. Tel Aviv was a couple of sand dunes before the Israelis built it into what it is.
They act like this was like fertile land only for the Israelis. Like this is such a load of crap. But go ahead, finish your thought.
They drained the swamps, they re-irrigated it, they brought modern sanitation, modern education, modern healthcare, and they helped reinvigorate it. They had the Ottomans' permission to emigrate there. They had actually pitched the Ottomans that they would be loyal to the Ottoman Turkish Empire, and originally probably planned to do so until things changed in the 19-teens. But the Arabs almost immediately started rebelling against it. But there wasn't a big once about 20 years in, Arab nationalism was surging at the same time. And Arab nationalism became defined as being exclusion of all colonialists.
Yeah.
And in their minds, that also especially meant Israel. no Israel. They opposed Israel's existence, started waging selective violence against them throughout the teens and the 20s and the 30s, had the Arab Revolt of 1936 to 1939. Then they aligned with Nazis. Nazis actually flew in to Palestine, paratroopers, to poison the wells of various Jewish settlements. And there was Jewish retaliation. There were Jewish militias formed as protection. And some of them you can have evidence of did bad and wrong things in retaliation. But they were almost always, the third major theme of this dispute is in almost every instance, Israel is responding. Israel is defending. Israel is retaliating. Israel is not initiating. It just
That's the point I was going to make, Robert. They want both sides of nationhood, right? They're the only nation, find me another nation in the history of civilization that gets to start a war and then lose, get their butt kicked, and then go to the international community and say, we really didn't mean it. Can we have our land back? Right? I've never anybody ever find another example other than the Palestinians. They rallied, and you brought up those examples, the 40s, the 60s, and all those examples where they rejected, it led to conflict, all right? Because what you're saying, Robert, and everyone has to understand, there can never be a two-state solution with the Palestinians because they don't believe, they don't accept Israel's right to have a state. So there will never be we always talk about it. Even Trump supported a two-state solution. George W. Bush supported a two-state solution. They won't do it even if you give them the goose, because as long as Israel is there and still has a footprint, they're going to have a problem with it. And that is what happened in the 60s, by the way. That was the most underhanded, backstabbing diplomacy, and they ran all the other. They did rally the Arab nations around them. Israel whooped them, and they wanted their land back.
It's important to remember, it was the Arabs who started it in the teens, started it in the 20s, started it in the 30s, started it in the 40s, started it in the 60s. It's in every instance, it's Arabs initiating attacks, initiating assaults, initiating terrorism. Or in 1948, it was all 6 Arab nations came in to go up against Israel and wage war on them. They just lost pretty badly. Then in 1967, it was the same thing again. And there's people that pretend that because Israel realized that the war was, and they just decided to do a preemptive action against the Air Force of Egypt and Syria, that somehow that means Israel started that war. Just go back and listen. All of the Arab radio TV stations were cheering for days and weeks in advance how they were about to crush Israel and wipe them out. So so all of that is mythology. It's just not accurate. And part of the mythology is the idea that their land was stolen. It's false. The other thing about this is in 1948, Israel got a lot more land because the Arab countries attacked, and Israel expanded their borders beyond what the mandate provided for, because again, it was the Arabs who decided to reject it. In 1960, now of note, Egypt seized the West Bank, and it had no legal authority to do so between 1948 and 1967. Jordan did the same thing the Gaza Strip. Jordan seized the West Bank and Jerusalem from 1948 to 1967, also didn't have legal authority to do so. And here's another critical point. We don't have to doubt what an Arab-dominated Middle East would look like, because we can just look at how they've treated Jews and Christians in that time period. By 1950, almost all Jews throughout all the Mideast were kicked out or expelled or had to flee their countries.
Yet you talk to anybody in media, and they all pretend like it was the golden era of Saladin or something, right? In the Crusade. It's crazy.
They're not really talking about the Arab caliphates. They're talking about the Arab caliphates did allow Jews to practice religion in order to pay a tax. They gave us, but it had second-class citizenship. There were frequent times where Arabs just wiped out, did genocide against Jews. So the idea of mass expulsion at different times. So the idea that this was some sort of peaceful, wonderful reign is nonsense. But even let's ignore the long history. Just look at the recent history. We don't have to doubt how Arabs would treat Jews, because they're almost all don't exist in their countries anymore, don't have legal protection anywhere in the Arab countries. But especially look at how ruthless and vicious both Egypt was in the West Bank, in the Gaza Strip, and Jordan was in the West Bank, and especially Jerusalem. The first thing the Jordanians did is kick out all the Jews from the Jewish quarter of the old city of Jerusalem where they had had continued residence for 3,000 plus years. They also kicked out by the way, limited the ability of either ones to practice any of their religion. By contrast, when Israel takes over Jerusalem, again in a defensive war, not an aggressive war, in 1967, what have they done? They've completely protected the Temple Mount. They've turned over the Temple Mount's entire control and security to a trust of the Jordanian government, and they've allowed Christians complete access. The only people to ever protect Jerusalem as the international religious site it should be has been Israel.
Is the state of Israel. That's it.
Frankly, neither did the Crusades or the Christians do it. The only people who've ever done it is Israel. So that's the other context. The other thing with this, if the shoe had been on the other foot, the Arabs would have kicked all Jews out of West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem. How do we know that? Because it's what they did when they seized control in 1940.
Yeah. Past the prologue.
That's the reality. I'm not calling for that as a remedy, but the fact that the Israel allowed everybody to stay, didn't do mass expulsions, has only done occasional evictions, hasn't even followed through on land law to evict people who don't belong in the places they're living in and haven't paid rent for 50 plus years, is a sign of how they've tried to respect the rule of law and tried to respect the reality of that while at the same time protecting their security. Which is to the detriment of their security in the long run, and they know it. I mean, really. They have favored human rights over their security interests.
That's right.
They've even released public access to their full archives in the 1980s. You're not going to find any Arab country ever do that. So the idea that there's any comparison between Israel and a Islamo-fascist state that the Palestinians want, or that there could even be a solution even the idea of a two-state solution that Hamas talks about is, we'll recognize you for 20 years and then we'll take you out. You give us time to form a state. I mean, Yasser Arafat in 2000 turned down a two-state solution with 95% of the West Bank and Gaza and Jerusalem as his capital with $30 billion in tow. He still turned that down. They're never going to be interested in a peace that includes they turned down in the 1930s the British request for a very tiny Israeli state. It's already tiny. I mean, this is a speck of sand amongst an Arabian empire of various Arabian nations. It doesn't have oil. It doesn't have a bunch of resources. In fact, there was crap land until the Israeli settlers got there, just realistically. And so any other story is a narrative, it's a fiction, it's a falsehood. And if you deep to the Noam Chomskys and the Finkelsteins and the others in the Greenwalds of the world, they will occasionally admit that what they really want is no Israel.
Well, right, because that's they have to be intellectually honest about this, Robert. They have to be intellectually honest. And I will give the prior administration credit for learning a very simple lesson, which is that and think about this when you consider the AP shacking up with Al Jazeera in a Hamas-owned building, right? So these people have been the guilt-driven West for a long time. The Western powers are never going to be productive in this because, the British, the French, this is all of their problem, especially Great Britain. This is their problem. They created this modern problem, all right? So all you can do is isolate the Palestinians from the Arab world, which is what Donald Trump was doing with John Kerry whispering in Mahmoud Abbas's ear and the PLO's ear, or the PLA's ear, don't settle. We're going to get rid of Trump. He's not going to make it another 4 years. Don't worry. Do not take this deal. Because this was just 8 months ago, Robert. 8 months ago. This is what the scene was. I find that extraordinary, and now here we are. But the Trump administration knew that. They had to be isolated.
Right. And there's two things that people need to understand. Large parts, forever, the Saud family has not been for pan-Arab nationalism, and they see it as a threat. Other governments within Arabia are the same. And what Trump was doing well was parlaying that. Saying, look, this Palestinian cause is just a disguised Islamic fundamentalist cause these days, and it's an Islamo-fascist cause, and it's a pan-Arab nationalist cause that poses a risk to the Sauds, just as the PLO did to Jordan in the late 1960s, just as the Lebanon Civil War is all about the PLO.
Yep.
I mean, they triggered it, created it, fostered it, were the cause of it, frankly. So many parts of the Arab world they've never been obsessed with this region, for one thing. They obsess about Israel being there. That's their only obsession. But a lot of them have never been on board with pan-Arab nationalism in the first place. And they've had to deal with internal religious and political disputes that became obsessed with Israel or America. But many of the royal families have no interest in it. And ultimately, the PLO tried to overthrow the king of Jordan at one point. They were supported the people who overthrew the royal family in Iraq. Yep. So there isn't really a lot of love lost there. Trump was wisely recognizing the best way to get a solution is to get the old royal families of the Arabian continent against the Arab nationalists and against the Palestinians, and cut a deal with Israel and end the conflict in that capacity, because it's creating too many internal problems for them. But and the other mythology here is what the left did is they recast the Palestinian cause as a civil rights, civil liberties cause. Yes. Beginning in the late 1960s, when it was cool to be and hip to be with the Palestinian terrorists, and throughout the European left. And then that took on a new level after 9/11, when a bunch of the neoliberal or liberal crowd that had otherwise been more sympathetic with Israel saw minority oppressive Islamic regimes as now minority oppressed Islamic regimes. And that's why the narrative about everything related to Palestinian dispute will sound just like the BLM narrative, will sound just like color regime change narratives, color revolution narratives. It will be strikingly similar. And it'll always be about poor little women and children being evicted or being bombed or being
apartheid.
I mean, that kind of language. In other words, here you use your region to constantly attack Israel, and then they put up a wall to try to protect them, and suddenly that's apartheid? Name the country that has 20% Jewish residents in the Arabian world. There's 20% Arabian citizens, Arab citizens in Israel. So there's just no comparison whatsoever to these two. Does Israel make mistakes? Plenty of mistakes. And
everybody does.
Particularly the Netanyahu version of Israel on foreign policy, absolutely. I mean, he supported war in Syria, war in Iraq. He supported the Iran war. I get it. He saw it as a way to limit the capabilities of his opponents and tie them down. But that isn't our problem and shouldn't be our problem.
Yeah.
So that's where I break with the Israeli right. But on all this other stuff, to see Glenn Greenwald and so many of the anti-war crowd embarrass themselves routinely with their pro-Palestinian talking points, pretending they take the same people who would never trust BLM, say, on the anti-war right, buy into every
somehow, right.
The pro-Palestinian crowd. I mean, coming forward, like Greenwald's trying to make a big deal about the AP building getting bombed, and I'm like, everybody knows the AP is embedded with Hamas in that region. You can't be
everybody.
If you say anything hostile to them, you'll get beaten up or maybe killed. So all you are is a propagandist for them. So of course are going to put you in the same building that they're in, and they're warned in advance. We know everybody's there. We know Hamas is there. We're going to bomb the building. Everybody get out. Give them plenty of time to evacuate. Something Hamas doesn't do when they're not busy bombing.
I was just going to say, unlike Hamas, hundreds of rockets from that area flying into Jerusalem before they leveled that building. Hundreds of understand that. Try to imagine what it is like to live life like that. And by the way, without the Iron Dome, now Joe Biden says we're going to be neutral, right? So does that mean when the Iron Dome runs out, it runs out, Joe? I mean, because they rely on us for constant support for the Iron Dome. If that Iron Dome was not there to intercept those rockets, I mean, I'm old enough to remember when there wasn't an Iron Dome, and there were dead Israelis in the streets every day almost, it seemed like, Robert. Bus gets hit, kids are dead, women are dead, the cafe, right? They're outside in the cafe, 1 minute sitting around the round table, the next minute it's a parking lot leveled. I mean, that is what it was like before the Iron Dome. So imagine, still, the Iron Dome's not perfect. Imagine what it's like to live under the threat. From Monday to Wednesday, there's 280 rockets lobbed at you. I mean, this is just crazy. Again, it really comes down to the intellectual honesty, man. They don't, if you're going to back the Palestinian cause, then you have to be intellectually honest enough to admit that you don't believe Israel has a right to exist. Just admit it. Just admit it.
Don't say you believe in a right to return, which would wipe out Israel, but which would have a overwhelmingly Arab Muslim dominant majority. And we already know, again, what that looks like based on what all the other Arab Muslim countries have done. The other aspect, like Glenn Greenwald was baffled. He was like, why are America First people pro-Israel? And it's like, what world is... I mean, I get Greenwald lives in a tiny little echo chamber when it comes to this issue. We'll repeat lies again and again and again on this issue. Almost all of my friends in the anti-war community repeat some of the dumbest lies. Like, I mean, there's a great book by Dershowitz called A Case for Israel.
Fantastic book. Yeah.
And he puts in what this would sound like in a trial. Try to refute it, or read Chomsky. All Chomsky will do is highlight what he considers Israeli abuses in the West. He won't deal with the core issue. He's not willing to be intellectually honest. He originally said, by the way, that a Lebanon-style government would be the solution. Yeah, how did that work out?
They destroyed that country, Robert. They destroyed that country when that was a Christian majority country.
None of them will be intellectually honest about this, but they also just push some of the most lunatic lies and I mean, the degree of mythology after the Nazis, almost the whole Arab world, not so much the Saudi Arabia, but the rest of the Arab world, particularly Iraq, Iran, Syria, Lebanon, the Muslim part of Lebanon, and Egypt, bought into a whole bunch of Nazi ideology. Indeed, you could explain pan-Arab nationalism by comparing it to Aryan nationalism, that it became similar in its obsession with the Jews. And they believed the most ridiculous, anti-Semitic, vicious, virulent ideology anywhere. And so you have that problem that's built into their mythology. You know, they believe the protocols of the elders of Zion, all this, I mean, the most ridiculous anti-Semitic nonsense. So that overlaps. And that's like what a lot of Israelis will say on the peace side of the equation. Other than being waken up to the 2000 reality that that really is that it's about ending Israel, not about a Palestinian state, never has been. It's never really been about right to return. It's about right to eliminate Israelis. Which they fully understood after the 2000 peace deal, Arafat's rejection of getting everything he claimed he wanted and still rejected it. And then they realized that if it wasn't Arafat that was the core of the problem, when he dies and Hamas rises, they realized, okay, no, this is a problem of Arab nationalism writ large that just doesn't acknowledge that we have a right to exist. But in the whole context of this, they've deepened not only fairy tales about the Palestinian narrative and the Israeli narrative, they've also created deeply anti-Semitic, vicious ideologies throughout there. I mean, you have 90% of people in places in parts of the Arab world that believe the most crazy Jewish stereotypes. This is what Gad Saad, who's an escapee from Lebanon, talks about. He talks about it jokingly. He said, I'll be sitting there chatting with an Arab. If he doesn't know I'm Jewish, he'll say, his wife left me, and he'll blame the Jews. He'll say his beer spilt, and he'll blame the Jews. He'll say his rent's too high, and he'll blame the Jews. There's a lot of that in the Arab world. So that's another reason why America Firsters why would America Firsters want to support an Islamo-fascist regime that cheered 9/11 for Glenn Greenwald's wake-up call? No, we're not in favor because Trump was right. It wasn't just Jersey City, though. It was predominantly in the West Bank and filmed on live video in Eastern Jerusalem, where they were cheering 9/11 and handing out candy saying it was a treat from Osama bin Laden. So when you decide to cheer terrorism against the United States, well, F you. We're not on your side. America First ain't going to be on the Islamo-fascist side anytime soon, Glenn. And just because you decide to live with your head up your ass, the rest of us don't.
Yeah, I really gets, you said it before in the Noam Chomskys, which I know they love. They're always citing Noam Chomsky, right? The bottom line is that you cannot get, all he's doing is focusing on the occurrences that really are just stemming from the core problem. And he's focusing on that without addressing what the core problem is. And, with all of these propaganda stuff, I just the other day, I just saw a reference to the so-called paramedic, or the medic, right, who was supposedly, this was a couple years ago, shot and killed by the IDF, all right, and the Western media was saying, they pushed it like it was, Hamas propaganda. The Israelis gunned down this poor woman. She was just trying to get in there and give medical assistance to people. The IDF gave all of these outlets video footage of her, saying, my name is blah, blah, blah. I am here as a shield. She was there on purpose as a shield. I saw her referenced by some of these people just the other day on Twitter. They don't know. They still believe this lie from it's like a 3-year-old lie, right? And they still believe, it was 2018, I believe. I don't want to try butchering her name, otherwise I pull it up, but it's on PPD. People can go read all about it. And there's a follow-up story, by the way, to Rashida Tlaib having people with known ties to Hamas in her office the day they were killing the bill, or it wasn't even a bill, it was a resolution to condemn Ilhan Omar for using what was blatantly anti-Semitic language. Democrats couldn't even get that through, and they caved to folks. These people are known associates of Hamas and Hamas organizations, and they are in the halls of Congress meeting with Rashida Tlaib. So forget about what role you could possibly think the AP might play in this bullcrap and twisting the narrative and twisting reality. But look, we have congresswomen walking around with these people, and you didn't hear a peep about it. So no, this idea that like Al Jazeera's in that building, Robert. This is a company. They are literally anti-Israel. I mean, not just, it's a slant, it's a bias, like we used to think about the old legacy media here in America. No. That is not what their job is. It's not to get a party elected, to help the Democratic Party or something. This is something much more nefarious. By the way, somebody who worked for Al Jazeera, so do I. They hate Israel. They want them gone. It's not a matter of political disagreement. They want them gone, and they will push Hamas propaganda to help them. That's what they do. That's their job.
In the West, the core of anti-Israeli ideology stems all the way back to Marxist and communist. And they've been using the same script since the 1920s. And they momentarily dropped it in the 1940s because, of course, the Arabs...
A lot of overlap.
I mean, the one thing the Palestinian Arabs are good at is losing. They either lose or they lose. Yeah, but people don't know, most of the Palestinian Arabs, the reason why the Brits weren't real anxious to give them their own state was because they decided to side with the Ottoman Turks. It was some of the Jordanian and Iraqi Arabs that were actually opposing the Ottoman Empire and supporting the Arab nationalism, not the Palestinian Arabs. The Palestinian Arabs then turned around, of course, and joined the Nazis. And then in between, they fought the losing war in 1948, losing war in 1967, losing war in 1973, got kicked out of Jordan and got kicked out of Lebanon. So the one thing they do better than anything is lose or side with losers. But the one group that they aligned with ideologically where they had some success was siding with communists and the hard left. And most of this ideology, if you read it closely, and that's what I tell some of these people. Like people
Tons of overlap.
It's here, look what Finkelstein has written about how terrible Israel is. And I'm like, well, now go read Finkelstein on Trump. And he says the exact same things about Trump he says about Israel. And you'll realize this just comes from a leftist ideology that refuses to acknowledge the real issue. If they're intellectually honest, Chomsky has occasionally been honest enough to admit he doesn't recognize Israel's right to exist.
Right.
He knows that's very unpopular and makes his position sound ludicrous, so he mostly stays away from overtly talking about it and instead doing micro-examination of the difficulties of you dealing with occupied territory. Israel has occupied territories. It's a problem. It's at a political no man's land. They refused to do what the Arabs did, which was purge the land of anybody that was politically opposed to them. The consequence of that is that they're dealing with a bunch of people that want to kill them on a daily basis. And how do they deal with it? And they've been trying to deal with it, and they make a lot of mistakes in that process. But that's not by any means a perfect circumstance or situation. But it's a situation born of the Arab response, not born of Israel's desire to be in that place in the first place. In 2005, they removed themselves from Gaza Strip. What happened? Does peace and prosperity come to the Gaza Strip? No, they use it as a staging ground, like the Israeli right said would happen, to make it easier to shell Israel. Precisely what happened. And, the other thing with Glenn Greenwald, it's like, hey, Glenn, when are you going to honeymoon on the West, in the Gaza Strip? Just walk down the street.
Knock yourself out. Knock yourself out.
I mean, they're going to throw you off a rooftop. I mean, that's who I'm supposed to celebrate? I mean, do I want U.S. troops there? Of course not. Israel can handle itself, and it's quite good at it. Proven that for a century. But the idea is that we should buy into this Palestinian mythology and rhetoric and language. They're just doing this to play. They deliberately induce false crises, stage events to make sure that they have the most compelling victims solely for the Western public narrative. So some sucker and sap in the left will become anti-Israel and push their anti-Israeli agenda. When not only am I not anti-Israel, I have no interest in seeing Islamofascism rise to more power in the Middle East.
Even the Arab Party in Israel, which is, they are their legislature in the Knesset, right? And they're a coalition in the Knesset. They always align with the left, and that is because, listen to their platform. They are statists. They are left-wing. I don't even think socialism is the right word. And probably, given a majority, it would be, you'd really see the real face at that point, honestly. And this people, one of the dumbest things I hear on Twitter all the time is, Benjamin Netanyahu started another war to help him because he was in political trouble. You handed a gift to Benjamin Netanyahu because it no doubt does help Likud when this happens. I've seen this before. There's no doubt.
They staged this around a Supreme Court case that involves Israeli property that's been entitled to Israelis since the 1850s in the Ottoman Empire. Property that was temporarily taken over by Jordan in 1948 to 1967 when they expelled the lawful Jewish occupants of the property. And when Israel took it back over, they didn't expel people like the Arabs had done, like the Jordanians had done,
right,
like the Egyptians had done. But they did want them to finally pay rent. And they've been asking them to pay rent. They agreed to pay rent in the 1980s and then said, nah, we're not going to pay it after all, and haven't been paying it for 30 years. And all they're asking is for them to finally pay rent. Hamas decided to make it as, oh my God, they're evicting more poor Palestinians from historic Palestinian land and property. It wasn't, another lie. And they used that. And then there's a long history of the Palestinian Arabs staging events around either Ramadan or other holidays. There's a reason why the war is called Yom Kippur. They decided to wage a war on the Jewish holy day. I mean, this is how they operate. They staged the first riots in Palestine around a Muslim holiday because those are great guys, great way to organize without people being able to process what's going on, use it as a staging ground to do it. See if you notice the same tactics that BLM and the color revolutions use. It's not a coincidence you're seeing the same behavior. You cannot trust anything anti-Israeli media or intellectuals say, even if it comes from anti-war sources who are otherwise reliable. They're complete crap on this topic. If we were in trial, Dershowitz's argument would win with ease with any impartial jury. None of these pro-Palestinian anti-Israeli sources.
Yeah, I never understood some of these, the only overlap is authority, really, right? So where the belief or the need for a big authority or a big central power, because there is no, and it's not just Glenn, because of the obvious, but anybody else who's on that far to the left, side of the spectrum,
Aaron,
the overlap here between certain rights of people, Robert.
About evangelicals having odd views related to...
You're afraid of evangelicals with gay marriage? You're afraid of evangelicals with...
We're going to talk about evangelical Christian odd views related to Israel. Let's talk about some of the Islamicists, the Islamofascist crazy ideas related to Israel and related to the Holy Land, related to other aspects. They don't want to talk about that because that would expose the hypocrisy, the duplicity, and the ludicrous arguments that they are making. It's you see Scott Horton. You see a wide range of anti-war sources that are otherwise really quite reliable at an independent perspective, even if you disagree with it, who are complete crap on the issues of Israel and Palestine. And I've argued for a long time, they're limiting their ability, rather than be baffled at why America First people don't support Islamofascism first, America haters first, rather than be baffled by that and expose your own incompetency, really engage the topic in a more informed, intelligent way. But here they have an echo chamber. Greenwald believes in this echo chamber. I mean, I remember years ago someone predicted to me about Greenwald. It's like, no, he wouldn't fall for that because Greenwald does a lot of great journalism in a lot of other areas, anti-surveillance state, etc.
Sure does. Yeah, sure does.
State, anti a lot of this January 6th nonsense. But on this topic, they turned out precisely right. They predicted to me something that would happen a week before it happened, and how a news story was unfolding, and how the Palestinians were promoting something as, oh, look at the Israeli snipers just randomly killing poor little kids, when in fact it was Palestinians going up and throwing rocks to provoke a response that they got certain things done. And Greenwald fell just for it. And when I saw him fall for the AP Tower story, I was like, come on, this is an obvious lie. This is a half-ass lie. I mean, that's the thing with the Palestinian lies. The Palestinian Arab side, they tell some of the dumbest lies that are easy to disprove. I mean, not just the ridiculous Jewish conspiracy nonsense. If you dig into the Palestinian concept, there are many of them that will tell you there was no Israel. Israel didn't exist.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, they believe in the most preposterous, lunatic notions. And yet they have these...
Talk about conspiracy theories, man. Talk about conspiracy theories on some of the origin of Israel. It's like, everything in the Bible is fake, and they never... I mean, it's the craziest nonsense. Look, I'm not saying everything Bible, you read it word for word. There are historically proven timelines of events here, people. This is not like a religious conversation. This is a historical conversation. And they can come up with the craziest ideas that are counter to everything we know about the history of that region.
All of a sudden, Egyptian sources are lying. Roman sources.
Yeah, they're all Greek.
Greek sources are lying. Archaeological sources are lying. They're all lying.
Herodotus.
And only the Palestinians have this special divinity to a unique form of truth about even though all of their claims can be empirically disproven again, and some easily. I mean, some of them are just dumb ideas, ridiculous ideas. So it's but I've been telling the anti-war crowd, they limit their credibility because with what I would call the America First crowd, because a lot of America First people, there's a lot of foreign policy most Americans have no clue about. They just heard the propaganda, usually buy the propaganda. They don't know enough about that region, that place, that dispute to know about it. This is not one of them. This is one area where Americans on this issue tend to be unusually well-informed, tend to dig in. They dig in because they debate it in high school, debate it in college, become curious about it for other reasons. Maybe they're connected to the evangelical community, have their own interest in it. Whatever it may be, this is a topic they're well-informed about. And when they hear anti-war voices repeat some of the most half-assed, nitwit propaganda on the Palestinian side, those anti-war sources, suddenly they're going to turn off from those sources as to everything. And then, the contrarian ideas about Putin or Chavez or anything else that's happening in the world won't be heard. The other side won't be heard. Just the pro-war side will be heard because many people that are inclined to be anti-war and are American
lose their credibility.
Yeah, they'll say, I can't trust that source. I mean, because that source lied to me in an easily provable way that I know is false about issues related to Israel and Palestine. So, I mean, and why the war side has ever taken... I mean, I get the historical alignment between the communists and the Islamists. It's still insane, fundamentally insane. These are people.
Robert.
A Hamas leader got executed summarily because he was alleged to be gay. I mean, this is who these people are.
That's what I was going to say. Some of this stuff is crazy.
I want nothing to do with it.
That's what I was just going to say. Some of this stuff is crazy because they make these things up to be able to justify these gross inconsistencies. You cannot claim to be champions for some groups of people, the LGBTQ communities, right? Certain minorities, religious minorities, racial minorities, and be pro-Palestine. It does not mix its water and oil, folks. These are people that would recognize no human rights for some of these groups. So they have to come up with these crazy ideas to make it work.
My always argument is, give me this Arab state. Would any Jewish person choose to live in an Arab state compared to whether an Arab person would want to live in Israel? Because they got full protections in Israel. There's no Jewish person better treated in an Arab state than the Arab citizens are treated in Israel. There's not even an argument. And there's been no argument on that for the last half century plus, since these states emerged out of the Ottoman Empire. So, I mean, once that, and then you add Islamo-fascist terrorism and anti-Americanism to the equation, people still don't reckon. What state do the Palestinians want? The Palestinian Arabs want for Israel to become a Sharia law governed state. Sorry, not interested. Don't like it.
Doesn't work.
And in the name of tolerance, I'm not going to say, I think the most intolerant group of people in the world with some of the most abominable ideas in the world, I'm not in favor of them coming to power, and I'm not going to be on their side, nor is anyone else in the America First movement for the most part. So I think that's an answer and a retort to Glenn Greenwald's question as to why are America Firsters not pro-Islamo-fascist?
Yeah, and point me to that tolerant Islamic nation. Where is it? I don't see it. You can't point to any. Look, you're not allowed to say these things in the so-called mainstream media. You're just not allowed to bring it up, but it's a reality that they can't get past. And by the way, Donald Trump doesn't have a Twitter account, but the leader of Hamas does, to be able to celebrate the rockets that are raining down on innocent people. I mean, it's incredible. This takes it to another level. I always pick on them for, the Hillary Clinton. The FBI, by the way, this week quietly said, you know what? James Hodgkinson was a domestic terrorist, and the 2017 shooting at the baseball field was domestic terrorism. Move on, right? And it barely gave it any glance whatsoever. So here we had every major network, half of Fox News, right? Hillary Clinton, all of their blue checkmark verified journalists pushing a dangerous, and that was always the thing about the Russia collusion hoax. It wasn't just a hoax, like a smear, like a political smear. It was a dangerous smear. It was dangerous like the Charlottesville hoax was dangerous. Only you're telling the country that their leader is a traitor who colluded with a foreign hostile power to steal an election. The shooter, and I shouldn't have said his name because I typically have a policy of not saying names, but the shooter at of the Republican charity baseball game was fully convinced that Donald Trump was a traitor and that Republicans were enabling a traitor and that it was his job to do something about it. I know because we have the screenshots before Facebook deleted his account. He thought Elizabeth Warren was right, that millions of Americans would die because this traitor was going to repeal Obamacare. They filled his head with these lies. And that led to the shooting of Steve Scalise and 4 others. Not a fake killing insurrection that was really a stroke that we needed to use as a fake death for a month and a half to blame Trump supporters for coming up with some fake insurrection in January. No, this was a real event with real violence. There was a real implication of the entire media apparatus and political leaders pushing the most. Really, just listen to how it sounds. It sounds ludicrous on its face, but they pushed it like it was real to the point where even average Americans were like, well, this can't be false. They wouldn't lie this bad, would they? I know the media lies, but could they really sell us this load of crap? Would they really dare to tell us that our president is a traitor? So this guy bought it hook, line, and sinker, Robert. He did. He bought it hook, line, and sinker. He's like, damn, he's selling change.org petitions every day. We got to get the traitor out of the White House. He believed all of it. He believed everything Rachel Maddow sold him, everything Hillary Clinton sold him, everything the Washington Post, the New York Times, CNN, and like I said, don't let Fox off the hook. They knew it was a fraud, but 50% of their staff still talked about it. Daytime talked about it like it was a legitimate story for almost 2 years. And this is what happened because of them. And they have Twitter accounts. All of them still have Twitter accounts. So, it's just it's beyond a double standard. It's beyond it. And here you have literal terrorists. People have to understand Hamas has different wings. There's a political wing of Hamas. There's a violent jihad wing of Hamas. But they all have the same goal. So you don't get off the hook because you're a politician and you align with Hamas. That doesn't get you off the hook. No, you are still a radical Islamist, period. You have the same goal as the guys who put the vests on or the guys who load the tubes with the shells. You have the same goal as them. So I don't understand. Robert, I don't understand how you could possibly justify the arbitrary application of these bans, because they use it. I have examples of Rashida Tlaib's friends. I mean, you got to read some of it. You know what? Give me 2 seconds. Respond to that while I dig up some of these. I got some of these sayings. You guys are going to really... You want to hear what they really think about Israel? You're going to love this. I'm actually going to dig this up and look it up, Robert, because, I mean, it's that bad. You want to tell you, it is clear they do not believe in its right to exist.
Oh, completely. If you believe... The two things, if you believe either that it doesn't have a right to exist or even a right to return, that's the same thing as believing Israel has a right to exist. Right? If pretending that somehow the second isn't really the first, isn't processing. And one other component, two aspects of international law that are mixed. One is, up until World War II, the idea that most of U.S. land based on the right of land by conquest, aggressive conquest, not defensive conquest. After World War II is when international law shifted and said you can only claim land in laws of defense, if in a defense war. But critically with Israel, it doesn't matter for Israel because all of the land Israel has conquered has been by defense.
Yep.
Defense. I mean, it was the Arab nations were the ones that started the war in 1948. They started the war in 1967. They started the war in 1973. So the idea that, I mean, they were the ones who initiated conflict in Lebanon, the late 70s to early 80s, because they were using southern Lebanon that PLO mostly took over to bomb and harass Israelis. So the idea, Israeli action in every context has been defensive. And in my view, they have the legal right to annex the West Bank. And
the West Bank. Absolutely. They lost more than that.
Of any other nation, the Palestinians have chosen repeatedly not to assert real authority over them and accept them as a state, down deal after deal after deal after deal. And they seize these lands in defense. And they have been far better at protecting human rights than their predecessors or forebears were. It's not even close. There's no comparison to it anywhere else in the Midwestern world. Now, I think they're better off with a solution that doesn't do that politically. But, and that's what they followed now for more than 50 years, is, in fact, people forget, originally there weren't any walls in the West Bank or Gaza Strip. You could freely travel. It was only when they started doing consistent suicide bombing and intifadas and terrorist attacks from these regions that they put up walls. I mean, I guarantee you, if that was the Arab world, they would have purged everybody that was there that was of the opposite faith. They would have kept anybody there.
Oh, without a doubt. Without a doubt.
A lot happened. But somehow Israel is supposed to be totally different and then get hyper-criticized, mostly because they've chosen not to evict people, because they've chosen not to expel people.
They're creating their own problems in many ways.
And they try to manage a hostile population who wants them dead and wants to kill the entire country from, as they like to say, the Palestinians like to say, from the river to the sea. And so they want to drive Israel to the sea. That's what that means. Anybody who's pretending otherwise is nonsensical.
It's being
about Israel's origins. The reality now is, what do you want in that part of the world? Do you want Israel, a state that's an ally of the United States, that believes in democracy and human rights, that's protected Jerusalem's access for all faith? Or do you want an Islamo-fascist regime that believes in terrorism against the rest of the world, including America? It's really a no-brainer.
Here are some of the words of some of these people that were, I mean, these are Rashida Tlaib's buddies, all right, but they're also very active supporters of Hamas. One, Jinan Dina, all right, for instance, this was all on Twitter, okay, but Rabia Chowdhury was an attorney and an author, and at this point, he was invited at first to along with others, for the Muslim Leadership Initiative. And what it was supposed to do was like the Shalom Hartman Institute, and it was a program that, quote, here it is, invites North American Muslims to explore how Jews understand Judaism, Israel, and Jewish peoplehood, all right? Chowdhury was disinvited, all right, which he believed, along with Hassan, Hassan, who was part of it as well. He had done recent work on Israel to try to help people understand how Jewish settlers came back after, right? And then how that clashed with Palestinians in the West Bank. And he's basically trying to tell both sides of the story. Like, look, there's more than just the Palestinian version of the story. Not at all taking Israel's side, Robert. Just trying to give both points of view. They get disinvited from this, all right? And here's what Jinan Dina says. You both deserve it. Your work on Israel is abhorrent. The fact that you can't separate Zionism from Judaism is laughable. To be anti-Israel is not anti-Semitic. Being pro-Israel is actually more Christian than Jewish. Supporting Israel has no space in the Muslim world. All right? And then later she says, shame on Wajahat and Rabia and all the other Muslim and Arab sympathizers of Israel. F you and your normalization. And this is in response to simply saying that we should have maybe a two-state solution with normalized relations. Wouldn't that be the goal? No, it's not. F you and your normalization. When Israel kills, you're complicit. Razan's blood is on your hands. Enjoy your Ramadan, bastards. This was, by the way, during the holy month. And just for posterity here, Razan al-Najir, that was the woman that they painted, or it was a younger, not a girl, but a younger woman who was painted as this, medic who was just in there trying to treat the victims of the apartheid Israel regime, right? And as it turns out, she can right in the video, we have it up. People should search it. I mean, she's out there happy as hell in front of the camera. I'm here to be a human shield. I hope they kill me so I can be on Western television and everyone can trash Israel and make Israel look bad, right? I mean, some of these tweets are just, they're on and on. If people can't understand by now that Hamas was created in the mid-'80s as a resistance to Israel, that they are the only ones fighting for Palestine from within Palestine, then and then in parentheses, screw the PA, the Palestinian Authority, all right, then you all need to just off. So in other words, to her, the PA is not even good enough, Robert. Hamas is her champion.
Right.
Hamas is her champion.
Hamas exists because any attempt to recognize Israel is abhorrent to Arab nationalism. For people to go back, like Palestine,
that's
Palestine
right.
Name the Romans sort of derisively chose to the Jews they had just kicked out of Judea and Israel, and excluded from Jerusalem because it was the name of the land of the Philistines who didn't live there. So they like some people actually think it's there's still a connection. There's no connection to Philistines. That was just the Romans being the Romans.
Come on.
And you don't have to take my word for it. This is what the Palestinian Arabs said in the 1930s before the Peel Commission. They said Palestine doesn't exist. Palestine's never been a country. Palestine's never been a nation. This is Greater Arabia, and in their particular context, Syria. They wanted there to be one big, extensive Arab world that didn't recognize any Jewish state or any Jewish people. So that was what they themselves said in the 1930s. As to Jewish people properly buying the property, that same Grand Mufti who aligned with the Nazis admitted to the Peel Commission in the late 1930s that almost all the property that Jews had was legally and properly bought under Ottoman Turkish title from absentee landowners. Even he recognized that. So the fact they're willing to lie about that, they're willing to lie about anything, tells you why you can't trust them. But Hamas exists because being anti-Israel matters more than being pro-Palestinian. What
That's
matters
right.
Anti-Arab to be anti-Israel is to be Palestinian in Arab nationalism, and this is why Syria backed Hezbollah. Hezbollah's not really pro-Palestinian; they come from a Shia sect. Well, so why do they exist? Because
totally
they're
different.
Israel. It gives Syria credibility as we're really Arab nationalists because why? We're anti-Israel, not pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel. It's why nobody has brought Palestinians en masse into their nation and incorporated them into citizenship. If this, if you would think, it's what Israel did when all the Jews were kicked out of the rest of the Arab countries. They added them in. Most of the Arab countries did not return the favor. Indeed, Jordan kicked out the Palestinian refugees with the PLO. Lebanon kicked out as many Palestinians as they could with the PLO. Because it's not about being pro-Palestinian. There is no specific Palestinian identity. This is all about being anti-Israel. And unless everything else is political theater. This is what would, if the people want to really understand the Palestinian propaganda, this is what BLM would look like on steroids with real
Yeah.
That's
Unchained. Right. And you back them in the corner on anything like that, by the way, and you get this response. You should burn in hell along with Israel. That's the response I got. So, that's fantastic. I mean, along with Israel. So, again, if the core of this is they will never accept Israel. Never accept it at all. And, we're supposed to be the United States. After what's his name? We were just talking about him before, and it rejected the deal that Bill Clinton was working out. Arafat. Thank you. Public opinion, shifted heavily towards Israel because in the U.S., by the way, is what I mean. At that point, there was always like some content, it was always pro-Israel, but people were at least, if you grew up back then, you know what I'm talking about. It was like all eyes in the Middle East peace process. It was a big deal. Most people wanted a two-state solution. People did sympathize with the Palestinians in America. Yes, they favored Israel, but they sympathized with them and would have liked to see them get some kind of, remedy for both parties, for all parties involved. But then they just outwardly reject it, and you can see in Gallup tracking after that it cratered. Now recently we've seen an uptick, but that's because of what the left-wing institutions are doing in this country, Robert, with this, with education and propaganda.
I myself was on sort of the Israeli peace side of the equation from 1990 to 2000 because of being an Israeli troop that was on the Israeli left that was very anti the Israeli right. So was Dershowitz. Huh. And but I was listening to what the Israeli right said, and the Israeli right kept saying this other interpretation was correct, that if you study history, this was correct. There would be no solution because there's no belief in it, desire for it, wanting of it. And they ended up, and what it is the whole world woke up to that reality after Yasser Arafat's rejection. And then they woke up to it again after they got the strip. But the left just keeps doubling down and tripling down on their own mythologies and propaganda. And what also is misunderstood is large parts of the deep state, particularly the State Department, is anti-Israel. Large parts of the media is anti-Israel. I had a friend of mine who worked at CNN for many years, all anti-Israel.
I know who you're talking about. Yeah.
They got that guy. That guy felt confident enough, who was working at CNN, to say we need another Hitler because he understands what everyone else at CNN thinks about Israel. This is true when the CIA started putting out books after 9/11 that were, by Anonymous and all this other stuff, that was all about blaming Israel for the Middle Eastern problems. They said if Israel didn't exist, basically, there would be no more Mideast problems for the U.S. So large parts of the CIA became anti-Israel. In fact, this goes all the way back to the late 70s. Late 70s, key CIA people were working with high-ranking PLO members, including the Black September organizer, who helped do the assassinations of the Israeli athletes, and one of the most vicious people around. But he died because of Hezbollah in the blowing up the barracks. But so there's long-standing CIA there's still pro-Israeli CIA members, but it's nowhere near overwhelming. And I'll be doing a sidebar with Viva Frei sometime the next month or two with Amanda Milius, the director, author, producer of The Plot Against the President. She worked in the State Department.
Excellent. We have one of them on, too. Excellent.
And she detailed the State Department is filled, and I have other friends I won't get into who work in the State Department, filled with anti-Israeli people. This assumption, there's a reason why Obama was trying to get into bed with Iran, didn't try to rig the election so Netanyahu couldn't win, all the rest. The left has infiltrated more and more of the intellectual infrastructure in the academy to be very anti-Israel because it's rooted in variations of critical theory, variations of Marxist ideology.
Yes.
And that's another reason we shouldn't get anybody on the America First side shouldn't get any near that ideological intellectual space.
Well, look at this, Robert. During that, going back to when they tried to pass that provision condemning Ilhan Omar, one of the only vocal Democrats out there was Eliot Engel. Who took him out? The squad, the far left squad wing of the party took him out. And he was targeted by the people, targeted for, defeat, by the people who basically palled together. Look, CARE is not a civil rights organization. CARE was founded by two members of the Muslim Brotherhood's now defunct Palestine Committee. All right, the Palestine Committee was created by the Brotherhoods to advance Hamas's political and financial agenda in the United States. And in her office, when this was going on, and this was when Engel sealed his fate, I truly believe that. Nihad Awad, president at the meeting until he leaves office, he was one of the former committee members, Robert. And now he currently serves as the executive director for CARE, pretending to be a civil rights group, just simply advocating on behalf of Muslims while this provision was being deliberated. They drew the line there. I mean, the reason why I'm bringing this up is because the Democratic Party is becoming there is no space in the party for pro-Israel Democrats anymore. Schumer is like, if you take look, Elliot Engel was one of Nancy Pelosi's top lieutenants. So if Schumer, somebody like a Schumer is on borrowed time. He's either going to have to soften on that position, or it's just going to at some point, Robert, that's going to be an internal contradiction, because
two things have happened. That the religiously, most Jewish Americans are not religiously observant.
Not at all. Yeah,
there's always been a history of the left being intensely anti-Zionist from day one. And that's really growing and deepening because it's becoming part of critical theory. The whole goal of the Palestinians, beginning in the 70s, was to restructure and recharacterize their movement in the West, knowing that if they could undermine Israel's support by the West, they could wipe Israel off the map.
Yeah.
In their belief. Again, they got a long history of overestimating their ability to win anything. But putting that aside, again, nobody loses like the Palestinian Arabs lose. But putting that aside, they really believe it, and they propagandized very effectively. And they've increased and improved their propaganda. I mean, I started witnessing it in the 90s when the anti-war right started buying into anti-Israeli theories. And I was like, hold on a second. You don't realize who you're getting into bed with.
Yeah, I see that now. Still.
Marxist, maybe you're on the wrong side of the aisle.
Yeah, that's all over Twitter now too. I mean, there was always that element to the anti-war right that doesn't like Israel, and that's fine.
People still believe in lunatic Jewish conspiracy.
Yeah, but they're right.
George Soros isn't on the Israeli side; he's on the anti-Israeli side. So they haven't put one and one together quite yet. So this idea that it was the same mistake that the Jewish conspiracy theorists of the British elite did. The communists were completely anti-Zionist, and that's always been true of the left, including the Jewish left. But the degree to which the Jewish community in the United States starts to have less and less support for Israel will be a serious problem for Israel in the United States. Potentially, they still have some influential backers. Like Haim Saban and some others.
Yeah.
But they're not real politically active. The goal is Palestinian cause to use critical race theory and variations of it and other Marxist derivative ideologies to infiltrate the academy, infiltrate the culture, infiltrate the media. And I can tell you from friends, they've had great success in both the State Department, many think tanks, and in the media. And when I hear people say Israeli lobby, the Israeli lobby is way out lobbied by the Arab lobby.
It's not even close. Yep. We did. I don't know if you remember this, but we did that analysis. I remember they started targeting AIPAC like it was the devil. And, it's opensecrets.org, folks. It's not exactly hard.
When the left says that the gun rights only exist because of the secret NRA,
I know.
And people who say that pro-Israeli ideas only exist because of AIPAC, completely nuts. Completely wrong. The people that are pro-Israel because they've either deeply researched the subject, they're co-religionists, or they think that siding with the only democracy in the Middle East is a better idea than siding with Islamic fascists who did 9/11.
Right. Yeah, and going back to what we said before, real quick, about some of these people, their ties to different groups, like the president of not Bahrain, not Bahrain, the other one, basically said that they had a spotty record on whether or not they were inclusive, right? And he goes on to list all these different groups of people, and I'm struggling, and always did, struggling to see how people like Glenn Greenwald reconcile that. Like Mahmoud Abbas, this guy is ready to beat up a female journalist in the halls of Congress because she dared to ask him a question, and she's a woman. And worse, a Muslim woman. I mean, so the video, he looks like he's going to run right over her, you know? So this guy's like a thug, you know? He's like a thug. And I just don't know how you square those beliefs.
Barbarian culture, in large part. These Islamo-fascists who believe in fundamentalist Sharia law, I want nothing to do with. I don't want them anywhere near positions of power anywhere. That doesn't mean I'm willing to send
Tunisia.
troops anywhere. But the idea I would support them is insane. The idea that any America First person would support them is insane. It's just, it's nuts.
And it was Tunisia, that's right. When Tunisia says that you aren't dedicated to plurality, then you got a problem, man. Right? When your party is effectively persona non grata in the government, then because they feel that you're not inclusive enough in a place like Tunisia, you have an issue. I mean, try to wrap your mind around that. But yeah, Monkey Dowdy, I don't know. I can't pronounce his name perfectly, but this guy's got a long history of that. He was the executive director of CARE in Connecticut. That when we were on this, they scrubbed that from their website. It was there and it was gone. We had to take a screenshot of it because we knew they were going to do that to try to separate it. And basically, it'd been all over Tunisia and elsewhere trying to push this party, which was really Hamas interests in other Arab nations, right? So, basically try to spread the same way CARE is a political arm.
Exactly. All these people are competing to be the point of the spear for Arab nationalism, which is which main goal initially has been anti-Israelism as a way to prove you're Arab nationalism, and that's why Syria doesn't back the PLO, but does create Hezbollah. That's why PLO is kicked out of multiple countries, but purportedly everything about Israel is about the PLO and about the Palestinian conflict. That's what explains all the history of this. The goal, that's what Arafat's real goal was. He wanted to become that's the reason why Nasser didn't trust him. It's the reason why Assad didn't support him. It's the reason why Iranians didn't back him. Is because they saw him as a competitor to Arab nationalism. I mean, they originally wanted a pan-Arab state. They wanted a state that went from Egypt all the way. For a brief period of time, there was a united republic with Egypt and Syria. People forget about that for several years. That was Nasser's goal. Nasser's goal was a greater Arabia that extended from Iraq to Egypt up to Syria, and that included all of the Levant and some independent little Palestine in between, and definitely no Israel in between. And so that's what all of this is about. Why they're so obsessed with a tiny slice of the world has almost no resources in it, because of how it undermines their perception of Arab nationalism. It was a collateral consequence to the rise of Arab nationalism, and it's kept spinning out of control once it got into Islamic fundamentalist fascism. Ethno-nationalism has always been a problem, but then when it creates a religious fundamentalist sectarian violence, then you've really got a problem. And this doesn't even get into the Sunni-Shia disputes that are underlying a lot of the militia conflicts throughout the Mideast. So I think that the Democratic Party still leans pro-Israel, but more and more of the left is deeply anti-Israel.
I think that's going quick.
State Department infrastructure. So, but America First should not be on the, like some people said, why would America First be Israel first? It's not Israel first. It's just not Palestinian Islamo-fascism first.
Yeah, and that's why, by the way, with what you were saying, that's why when you see any chance for some of these nations to get a secular leader like a Sebsi was in Tunisia, that's what he was doing in there, Robert, trying to pollute his party. And for a while there, he actually formed a coalition with them to strengthen his government, which he was forced to break off when some of this stuff started to really become more and more apparent. And because once you give them an inch, they're like any other leftist, right, or statist or central power kind of worldview. You give them an inch, they take a foot. And so you try to stop. They basically tried to cut that off before it had a chance to fester. But look, we all know how that ended. It really didn't. I mean, it could have been worse, but it didn't. It wasn't what it was originally. That government was not originally what it was supposed to be. It was supposed to be completely secular, or at least it was supposed to be led by secular people and interests. But that didn't happen. So because that's not what they want, that's not their goal, right? I mean, that's just not part of who they are.
And I recounted the legal perspective. This was Ottoman Empire land that the Ottoman Empire vacated, that the British ultimately occupied. So there was no other, claim to that land to anyone else. This was land that the Israelis had bought legally from the existing title holders under the, as admitted by the Palestinian Arab leaders themselves in the late 1930s. They were recognized by the British, by the French, and by the United States all the way back to 1917. They were recognized by the United Nations in 1947. Any other land they have acquired since then has been in defensive wars. That historically they're entitled to govern however they want. And it's not land that was legitimately owned or occupied by any other country or any other nation. And it was in land that the Palestinians refused to accept to govern under a two-state solution. So that's where we're at today, which should explain for you why we're at where we're at today.
Yep, well said, well said. And, BB isn't a perfect leader. I'm not, trying to say that, but you got to feel like a man all alone at this point if you're Benjamin Netanyahu, right? So he knew what it was like for 8 years under Barack Obama. For 4 years, they had a U.S. president that they really felt truly was a partner and had their back, even though he backed a two-state solution.
He was clear-eyed about the issue. He understood exactly what.
Just clear-eyed. Isolate them.
He understood this was a problem of Arab nationalism, and who did he ally with? People who don't like Arab nationalism within the Arab world.
That's
to try to create alliances with Israel to undermine the Arab nationalist cause because other Arab nations would recognize Israel. I mean, that's why Trump was obsessed with it. The left tried to be dismissive of it. Oh, these Abraham Accords, they were huge.
They were a big deal.
He understood that Israel's right to exist was the core of the Palestinian terrorism. And that if you were able to get other Arab countries to recognize Israel's right to exist, then the pan-Arab nationalistic excuse because he had a plan to bring Jordan in by basically offering them a lot of money when they needed it. And he knew that the Jordanians would likely take it, at least historically. So he was on the cusp of multiple deals that would totally undercut the moral legitimacy and the narrative of Palestinian terrorism that justifies them. And his loss was the Mideast loss and peace loss in the process.
Yeah, and I think that's a lot more people's loss, right? So it wasn't just going to be a political win or a political achievement for him. Look at what it means to millions of other people that aren't even in our region. 4 more years, that argument, it's funny, being a businessman didn't serve him very well on Capitol Hill with these dirty, disgusting politicians who will stab you in the back, but it did serve him well on the world stage when it came to making deals like this. Look, guys, it's not about ideology. This stuff, these guys, they're bad for business. They're bad for regime stability. They're bad for regional stability. This is just bad business all the way around. Make the smart deal. Then that worked. And that was working. Even with John Kerry basically subverting. You want to talk about the Logan Act. Nobody's prosecuted over the Logan Act. But this was like subversion, Robert, what he was doing. Running around, talking to third parties in London, talking to a boss, right? I mean, just through third parties, talking to people in the Palestinian Authority. Don't make a deal, push, don't let a boss make a deal. I mean, he just surrounded the guy on all ends, telling him basically, Trump will be gone in 4 years. I don't understand what, and what was he telling him to hold the line for?
Because down deep, it's anti-Israeli beliefs. And
right, what's the end goal?
That thinks Israel being gone would allow America a greater free reign in the Middle East to do all of their other deep state agendas. They're fundamentally...
It's the only way it makes sense.
Correct. They're fundamentally wrong about that. I mean, people should have seen this. I think the title of the book is Blowback. It was a thinly disguised CIA-sponsored book. pretended it was an anonymous source who was coming out with secret inside information from the CIA against the CIA's wishes. That never happens, folks. Not in the modern age. That's a CIA-approved book if it even gets published. And so that's what that was. The whole message was, if we reject Israel, we can have free reign in the Mideast. And we don't have free reign in the Mideast because we support Israel. So that's why they were doing the deals with Iran. That's why that whole thing was going on. And again, he's showing you how tied in it is. As soon as Trump's in, almost all the violence against Israel goes down. As soon as Trump's gone, it suddenly comes back. And people think that's Israel's initiative? Come on. Right. Obviously what's going on. While we're sending $250 million to the Palestinians, at least some of which will end up in Hamas's pockets, no matter what they say. But very little of it will end up in Palestinians' people's pockets. Because just look up, Google or go to DuckDuckGo and look up Yasser Arafat's Swiss bank account, wife and and you can see what that's all about. It's part grift. It's always been part grift.
We've been funding Hamas for years, UNRWA through the UN. I mean, we've been funding the U.S. built those tunnels, the kidnapping tunnels. We built them. I mean, with our own money, giving money to UNRWA, which that materials never went for the schoolhouses. They never went for the hospitals because they had no interest in that. Instead, they'd rather take the money, buy concrete to wall up the tunnels so they can reach up, grab a kid or a soldier and pull it. I mean, it's just I don't understand.
Because their cause isn't their own people. It isn't a single group of people. Their cause is destroying Israel. That's
not
who
people.
To be pro-Arab means to be anti-Israel in their ideology, and that's been true for all the way back to 1905 when they were writing this in the Palestinian area by Arab activists. It's always been so that they don't care about the local population. They could care less.
No.
They don't care about refugees. They could care less. What they care about is using them as a proxy to wage war on Israel as an expression of Arab nationalism to remove Israel from the entire continent. That's their objective. It will stay their objective, and you have to be smart and savvy the way Trump was to figure out, well, who else is that not in the interest of in the Arab world? Align with them. I mean, Saudi Arabia has had a long history of antagonism to Arab nationalism because Arab nationalism has always been a threat to the Assad's rule, period. I mean, they're a small tribe who lucked out when they found oil. They were only seized power because nobody knew how much oil was under those Saudi sands. And then they were like, woohoo. But then they realized they had trouble. They'd created an alliance with Wahhabi Islam that they had, grandfather had done, that they had to deal with. And so they've always been trying to contain that. But they often see certain kinds of Islamic fundamentalism as a threat to their power. But particularly seen Arab nationalism, whether it was Nasser or Hussein or Assad, who had or the head of Jordan in that royal family before they were removed from Iraq as well. It's kept power in Jordan, thanks to the Brits mostly. But they see it as a threat, and so Trump was on the right path. It's unfortunate it's been unwound, but we're going to see more of this around the world because the Biden administration has a chaotic set of policies, deeply conflicted about where to go. The old Biden favors Israel as understanding these issues as a reflected, but the Biden teen people hate Israel. And it's going to be an interesting tightrope to walk, but what's likely to happen is you're going to see more conflict. And the Palestinians' whole goal is to create narratives that look like BLM narratives to sucker Americans into being sympathetic to them and antithetical to their natural allies, Israel.
Yep. Well put. That's it. And again, moral of the story here, folks. Two big takeaways. You cannot argue on the side of the Palestinians without being intellectually honest enough to admit that you do not believe in Israel's right to exist, because they will never take a deal, no matter how sweet it is, if it includes Israel being a neighbor or in existence. That is the sad reality. And then the second part is this is not about the human condition of anybody. anybody, the people of Palestine, nothing about their. If it was about the downtrodden and the poverty, then you would have saw those resources go to something else. But it doesn't. It goes to these endeavors. One terrorist infrastructure project after another. I mean, it's a terrorist infrastructure project. It's like what did Obama call it? Shovel-ready jobs for terrorists, man. I mean, get some UNICEF money. Dig a tunnel. I mean, it's just. And sadly, I think you're right. This will just continue, as will, which we didn't get to talk about, as will these attacks on infrastructure, which I don't buy 100% or Russia or a non-state Russian actor at all. I don't think we know at all. But I think this is going to...
It makes no sense for the state of Russia.
It makes no sense. It makes no sense.
Historically, when we've ever dug into this, if there's a state involved, it's almost always China or North Korea. That's
right.
how it's been over the last half decade. I mean, they originally accused Russians of the Sony hack. No, even though everybody's like, probably has something to do with the movie that was anti-North Korean, maybe the North Koreans. North Koreans spend a lot of money on hacking. It's one of the few things they are capable of.
Really do well, yeah.
Hacking. And then otherwise it's been China rings. Now, it could be a criminal gang operating out of Russia or Ukraine. That's always possible. But then you have to ask, how are we this vulnerable? Because a criminal gang should not have been able to hack into critical oil infrastructure.
That's right. These intel services don't do their jobs anymore. You told me you didn't hear it. You're telling me you heard no chatter about this whatsoever? Not a cyber or signal? Nothing? I don't buy it.
Much better protected and much better remedied quicker. Those parts just don't make sense. Explain it.
Yeah.
I mean, either our infrastructure is extraordinarily vulnerable, or this was an inside operation at some level, or was a staged event at some level in order for a broader political agenda. So
maybe
but it's got to have those other components, because the straightforward story doesn't hold up. It doesn't hold water.
This country's infrastructure is packed with private sector infrastructure. It is not what people seem to think. I'm stunned at the ignorance level with how infrastructure works in this country. Dams, bridges, and pipelines, among other things. Loads of it privately owned, which is why the decision the Biden administration made here, Robert, is one of the worst decisions. He set one of the worst precedents I think any U.S. president has set in a long time about anything. We could be crippled in the matter of days if this is the template that we're going to use going forward here. Of course, it wasn't public sector. A lot of infrastructure is not. So that means you can still allow some form. And the reason why I don't buy the Russia thing, and just saying, just because it's private does not mean you don't react from a government standpoint. It's still critical infrastructure. But I don't buy the Russian non-state actor thing here, man. Because if that was true, and it was Donald Trump was still president, he would have got on the phone. And rest assured, nobody is out of Vladimir Putin's reach, man. So if it really was some private and non-state actor acting without Vladimir Putin's okay, maybe it was with his okay, then there's only two outcomes here. One, if it was with his okay, you punish him. He's a one-resource economy. You can cripple him too. But Biden chose not to do that. He chose to do nothing. And then two, if it was without his blessing, you make sure Vladimir Putin remedies that real quick, which he can. Look, nobody does anything without Vladimir Putin's okay. You know this, man. Come on. And even if they did, there's nobody Vladimir Putin can't punish and, find and punish. So this idea that it's some rogue entity, none of this makes sense. None of it does. I am becoming such a cynic in my older age that immediately my mind goes to, this benefits those who want to make public ownership of all infrastructure in this country. That's who it benefits. And, like you said in your video last week, is it so ridiculous to believe those who benefit may be behind some of these things? Is it so ridiculous to believe?
That's why I say I don't think it'd be a Russian gang, because I have a hard time believing that just a Russian cyber gang pulled this off.
Yeah.
And I can't imagine it being Putin, because the last thing he wants is this How is this going to profit him?
Why would he do this? Yeah, what benefit?
Now, if the Russian gang was in Ukraine, it might be a different animal, because Ukraine is kind of chaotic right now. They're trying to prosecute their political opponents. We're trying to provoke a war with Russia, trying to get the U.S. to back more military action there. But everybody's turning on the oligarchs that run that country, both Russia and the U.S. So I could see something like it coming out of there, and there we couldn't do anything because of Biden's compromised relationship with Ukraine.
Yeah, maybe that's
The problem that doesn't fit for
makes
me
more sense
is this is too important infrastructure to be this easily vulnerable without an inside operator of some type and without institutional actors in support at some level. So because I just don't believe our infrastructure is actually that vulnerable, such that oil really had to be shut down for a week on the East Coast. I'm not buying that story.
And I sure as hell hope not. If it
together our infrastructure defense plans, they would have known about this risk for 50 years, and I guarantee they would have had a quick remedy. So the fact there wasn't tells me there's some other agenda.
Something else. Yeah. It doesn't jive with me either. And at this point, if you believe anything knee jerk out of the FBI, that statement looked like somebody cheaply wrote it up on Adobe real quick, or a wannabe Adobe. I mean, that was like very amateur. But if you believe anything that comes out of these people's mouths without verification or some kind of validation or a backup, a secondary independent corroborating source, then you're an idiot. I mean, at this point, you've been lied to about every major crisis event in the last almost century now. And I mean, going back to the Lusitania, which we were talking about last week on the show, I mean, you really have to be dumb to take somebody's word for it at this point. Look, who are they gonna wheel in on this one, Robert? The CrowdStrike? All right, are they gonna take screenshots again of? Are they going to take screenshots again and pretend like those are downloaded logs? I mean, I'm not going to buy. Fool me once, shame on me. Or shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me.
Yep. Indeed. I got to hop off here.
Yeah, man, that sounds. Tell people where to find you. It's 4:30. Let's kick rocks.
VivaBarnesLaw.locals.com.
Right under there. And as always, brother, I'll see you next week. Thanks for joining us. Guys, everybody, don't forget to follow Robert at vivabarneslaw.locals.com. You can join mine at peoplespundit.locals.com. And, of course, we will be back on Wednesday with Inside the Numbers with the People's Pundit at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Go ahead also to subscribe to the YouTube page if you like it. Hit the notification bell. That'll let you know when we're going to go live, all right? Like the video if you like the video. Hit the thumbs down if you didn't like it. Really quick note, it's May 17th for the public polling project for the summer. It is best early than later. People will get into their vacation habits, not want to be bothered. There is about the amount that we see right there right now, which you can go to at Big Data Poll / public polling project, bigdatapoll.com / public polling project, bigdatapoll.com / public polling project. There's more money in there than you see on that contribution board. We over-raised just under $2,000 for that first poll. That has to be rolled over, so we're really not as far away as it looks. All right? So we got a couple of, hopefully we can finish this up by the end of May, and then we can get it going before everyone goes off and runs to the beach and runs to wherever they're going. On vacation, all right, and we'll do Biden's approval again. We'll do guns. I think that's important considering everything that's going on. Robert and I talked a little bit about it today, but we want to talk more about social media censorship and the threat to free speech in this day and age. We'll take the pulse of the public and see what they think about this. Are they as concerned as some politicos out there, right? And then also, of course, we'll do the Registered Voter Economic Confidence Index. We predated the other indexes. I think we were a cautionary tale ahead of the tumbling consumer sentiment and the other obvious sentiment reports that aren't doing well. So we'll do that again. We'll wrap that up and we'll see. All right. So with that, I'm going to kick rocks. I'm going to get out of here. Thanks for watching. We will see you on Wednesday. All the best, folks.
The lights that shine down over dotted lines of white across an open highway, restless nights, coffee houses, clubs and neon lights. I rock the people my way, working my way, coming back to you, working my way, coming back. Take me home tonight, not wasting any time. Highway 95, engines on overdrive. From town to town, and in between, I see you in the morning.